Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Hotel room. I never liked the idea of staying in unfamiliar hotels. The hollow echoes in the hallway, the scent of cleaning chemicals, the clinking of keys at reception, everything about it just felt wrong. Yet, here I was, checking into a small, somewhat run-down hotel on the outskirts of town. It wasn't the plan, really, but the storm had come out of nowhere, and the place was the closest shelter. The receptionist, an elderly woman with a stoic expression, handed me a rusty key. The number on it was faded, barely legible. Room 17, she said, her voice like dry leaves brushing the floor. It's on the second floor. Stay safe. I nodded, feeling the weight of her gaze follow me as I turned away. Something about her presence unsettled me, but I shrugged it off. After all, I was just looking for a place to rest for the night. The room itself was small, but clean enough. A single bed covered with a simple white blanket, a small wooden desk, a wardrobe, and a chair by the window. It wasn't luxurious, but it was enough. I set my suitcase down and went to take a shower, hoping to shake off the lingering tension from the drive. It was as I was drying off, the air thick with steam, that I first heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound. At first, I thought it was the wind. The rain had picked up outside, hitting the window with sharp, sporadic taps. But then I heard it again, soft at first, but unmistakable. The sound of footsteps. I paused, towel still in hand, my heart beating faster. I thought perhaps it was just the old building settling, or maybe someone else in a room nearby. But the sound grew louder, more deliberate. Step after step, slow and heavy, as though someone was pacing in the next room. I listened, my breath shallow. I was certain the noise came from the wall that separated my room from the one next door. But when I tried to rationalize it, old plumbing, creaking pipes, none of it made sense. The sound was too consistent, too human. I shook my head, trying to ignore it. The storm outside was growing fiercer, and it wasn't worth losing sleep over something I couldn't explain. Still, the sound continued, echoing through the quiet, and I found myself straining to listen, unable to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. After a few more minutes, the footsteps stopped. I exhaled, relieved. But then came a knock at the door. Soft, almost hesitant. My pulse quickened as I stepped forward, peering through the peephole. There was no one there. Just the dimly lit hallway stretching into the darkness. I couldn't explain it. Who would be knocking at my door? No one had come up the stairs, at least not that I noticed. I wondered if the storm had played tricks on my mind, if it was all just a series of strange coincidences. But then came the voice. It was quiet at first, but distinct. A whisper from the other side of the door. Help me. I froze, heart pounding. The voice was faint but clear, a woman's voice. I leaned back, unsure what to do. My first instinct was to call the front desk, but when I tried to pick up the phone, there was no dial tone. The line was dead. The air in the room felt suddenly thick, stifling. The temperature dropped, and I shivered involuntarily. I tried to push the fear from my mind, telling myself it was just a prank or my imagination running wild. But that whisper, it lingered, echoing in my thoughts, even as the footsteps began again, now louder, as if they were getting closer. I didn't know what to do. The rational part of me screamed that it was just a hotel with thin walls, that this wasn't anything unusual. But the chill creeping down my spine told me otherwise. I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't alone. But I had no idea who, or what, was sharing the room with me. The footsteps stopped, but the air in the room didn't. It remained unnaturally cold, as if something was hovering just out of sight, waiting. I stood by the door, my hand still gripping the cold metal of the doorknob, uncertain of what I should do. The whisper, "Help me," still echoed in my ears, and every shadow seemed to stretch longer, darker. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe there was someone staying in the room next to mine who was pacing back and forth, the sounds traveling through the thin walls. I turned away from the door, trying to convince myself that I had nothing to fear. But the feeling of being watched refused to fade. My eyes darted around the room, taking in the mundane details, the faded wallpaper, the creaking wooden floor, the window barely cracked open. And yet, everything seemed off, like I was being pulled into a nightmare that had no escape. I went over to the window, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. But as I leaned out, I noticed something strange. The parking lot was empty, the cars silent, as if the entire world outside had vanished. The only sound was the rain, relentlessly hitting the pavement below. No footsteps, no distant chatter, just an overwhelming silence that felt suffocating. I pulled the window closed and stumbled back toward the bed. I needed to rest. I had to rest. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard it again, the soft tap of footsteps in the hall, the murmur of the woman's voice. It was as though the sounds were weaving into my very thoughts, drawing me closer to the edge of my sanity. Suddenly, the lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness. My heart skipped a beat. Then came a louder noise, scraping, as though something sharp was dragging across the floor. The sound came from the direction of the closet. My gaze snapped to it, and for a moment, I was paralyzed. The closet door was slightly ajar, as if something, or someone, was on the other side. I grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, and took slow, deliberate steps toward the closet, my breath shallow and quick. Every muscle in my body screamed for me to run, but my feet moved forward anyway. I reached for the door, but before I could open it fully, the sound stopped. Everything stopped. The only thing that remained was the relentless drumming of the rain outside. And then, a sudden knock at the door again. I spun around, the lamp trembling in my hand. The voice came again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was louder, desperate. "Please, let me in." I felt my heart hammering in my chest. There was no denying it now, the voice was real. Someone, or something, was on the other side of that door. I looked toward the window. The storm was still raging, the darkness outside complete, but the thought of leaving the room was paralyzing. I glanced at the door again, and my mind raced, trying to rationalize what was happening. Who could it be? I turned to the phone, hoping to get some help, but the line was still dead. I paced back and forth, my thoughts spiraling out of control. I needed to get answers. I had to know what was going on. Suddenly, a new noise broke through, the sound of something scratching at the door. It was faint, but unmistakable. I stepped closer to the door, my breath caught in my throat. Was someone really out there? Was it the woman I had heard, or was it something else entirely? My mind flashed back to the receptionist's words, "Stay safe." A cold shiver ran down my spine. I should have listened. But it was too late now. I slowly reached for the doorknob again, my hand shaking uncontrollably. And before I could open it, the door creaked as though someone or something on the other side was pushing against it. "Please, help me." The voice was no longer just pleading. It was almost frantic. I took a step back, my mind racing for an explanation, any explanation. But none came. And then, from behind me, came a sound I wasn't prepared for. A low, guttural growl. I whirled around, but there was nothing there. Only the oppressive silence of the room and the terrible weight of something, watching. Waiting. The growl echoed in my mind, reverberating through the silence. My body went stiff, as if my muscles had locked into place. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The air in the room grew heavier, thick with something I couldn't see but could certainly feel. I turned slowly, scanning the room with wide, frantic eyes. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, twisting around the furniture. The lamp in my hand felt like a poor weapon against whatever presence had entered this room with me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I stepped backward toward the far wall, my heart racing. The scratching noise from the door continued, like nails dragging against wood. It was rhythmic, deliberate. Not just from one spot on the door, but all across it, like something moving just beyond it, something waiting. I pressed myself against the cold wall, my breath ragged. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of the mind, that I was just imagining things, but deep down, I knew I wasn't. Whatever was in this room with me wasn't something I could explain away. A soft sound came from the corner of the room, soft, almost like a whisper. I dared not look, but I felt it, the undeniable presence, just out of sight. "Who's there?" My voice came out in a strained whisper, barely audible above the pounding of my heart. No answer. But the air grew colder, impossibly cold. A chill that sank into my bones and wrapped around me like an ice-cold hand. I glanced again at the door, then the window. The rain continued to pour outside, but the storm felt distant now, as though it were part of some other world. The hotel felt disconnected from time and space. It was as though the world outside had ceased to exist. It was just me, the room, and whatever was in it with me. And then the lights flickered again. For a split second, I thought I saw something in the corner, just outside my peripheral vision. A figure, tall, dark, but shifting, like smoke or shadow. It was gone before I could focus on it, but the sense of dread it left behind was enough to freeze me in place. The knocking came again, louder this time. "Please, let me in." This wasn't right. This wasn't normal. I rushed to the door, half expecting to see something or someone on the other side. But when I opened it, there was no one there. Only the empty hallway stretched out before me, dimly lit by a single, flickering light at the far end. I stepped out into the hall, heart thumping in my chest. My legs felt weak, like I was walking in a dream, but I had to know. I had to understand what was happening. I moved down the hallway, toward the source of the voice. I wasn't thinking clearly anymore. Every step felt like a nightmare, like I was moving through thick water. The air grew heavier with every step, thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something stale, like decay. Room 17. The door was cracked open, but no light came from within. Only darkness. I reached out to push the door open, my hand trembling, but as soon as my fingers touched the wood, the door swung wide on its own, and I stumbled back. Inside, the room was wrong. It was exactly like my own room, but everything was reversed. The furniture was identical, but the air felt colder. The shadows in the corners seemed to move, twisting and shifting like they were alive. And there, standing in the middle of the room, was a figure. It was a woman dressed in an old, faded nightgown, her hair matted and wild. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, staring directly at me with a look of pure terror. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The silence in the room was unbearable. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. It was like I was paralyzed by the sheer horror of what I was seeing. The woman reached out toward me, her hand trembling. Her skin was ashen, almost translucent, like she hadn't been alive for years. "Help me." The words came again, but this time they were accompanied by a deep, guttural growl that shook the walls. The air seemed to pulse, and the temperature dropped even further. I felt the presence, its weight, pressing down on me from all sides. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to turn the doorknob, but it was locked. I was trapped. The woman's voice, now frantic, echoed from the dark room. "It's too late. They're coming." I spun around, facing the hallway again, but it had changed. The walls were closing in, the ceiling descending, and the lights flickered erratically. I had to get out. I had to find a way out. But no matter where I turned, no matter what I did, the walls seemed to press closer, tighter, and the growl grew louder, more desperate. There was no escape. I was trapped. The hallway, which had seemed so long and endless when I first entered, now felt like a confining tunnel, squeezing in on me from all sides. My heart raced in my chest, the sound of my pulse deafening in my ears. I clawed at the doorknob, desperate to escape, but it wouldn't budge. It felt like the hotel itself was holding me captive. The woman's voice continued, distorted now, as if coming from all around me. Her words tangled with the growls, mixing into a low, almost inhuman sound. It was like they were coming from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. Everywhere. "They're coming," she repeated, each word heavier than the last, as though the weight of it was bearing down on me. "You're next." I wanted to scream. I wanted to shout, to cry for help, but my voice caught in my throat. The pressure in the air was suffocating, thick with fear and something darker, something older. The walls around me seemed to pulse, as if the building itself was alive, breathing. The temperature plummeted further, and I could see my breath misting in the air. I looked down at my hands, which were shaking uncontrollably, and then back up at the hallway. The lights flickered again, the faint buzzing in the air echoing like a warning. It was then that I heard it, the scraping again. A slow, deliberate sound, like nails dragging against the walls. But this time, it wasn't in the distance. It was behind me. I spun around, and for the first time, I saw it clearly. A figure, dark, shadowed, and indistinct, stood at the end of the hallway, at the edge of the light. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that twisted in unnatural angles. It wasn't quite human. Its form seemed to flicker and shift with the dim light, like a distorted reflection in water. I froze, my body rooted to the spot. My mind screamed at me to run, to do anything, but I couldn't move. I could feel the presence growing closer, the oppressive weight of it crushing me from all sides. The shadows seemed to swirl around it, making it look even more monstrous, as if it were pulling the darkness itself into its form. The scraping noise grew louder, closer, and suddenly it stopped. The figure was just a few steps away now, and I could feel its gaze, cold, empty, and full of malice, bearing down on me. Its face was featureless, just a dark void that seemed to consume everything around it. And then, the woman's voice came again, but this time it wasn't from the room. It was right beside me, in my ear, whispering in a tone that made my skin crawl. "You're too late," she hissed. "They're already here." I stumbled backward, panic rising in my throat. My heart raced in my chest, every fiber of my being screaming for me to run, to escape. But I knew it was pointless. The hallway was closing in. The shadows were closing in. The thing at the end of the hall was almost upon me, and I could feel the cold, deathly chill of its presence as it reached for me. The lights flickered one last time, plunging the hallway into darkness. And then, silence. For a moment, everything was still. The air was thick with tension, and I couldn't hear anything, no footsteps, no scraping, no whispers. Only silence. The oppressive, suffocating silence that threatened to swallow me whole. But the silence didn't last long. A single, heavy breath echoed from somewhere in the dark. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe. And then, the darkness shifted. The figure was gone. But I knew it hadn't left. It was still here. Still watching. I turned around, looking frantically for a way out, but there was nothing, no door, no exit. Just endless walls of darkness closing in. I couldn't escape. Suddenly, the door to room 17 creaked open again, as if inviting me back inside. I didn't know why I walked toward it. I didn't want to. But my body moved of its own accord, dragging me toward the door as if something was pulling me. Inside the room, everything was as it had been before. The furniture, the walls, the silence. But this time, it felt different. Darker. I stepped forward cautiously, my eyes scanning the space, expecting something, anything, to happen. Then, I heard it. A low, distorted laugh, deep and rumbling, like something that didn't belong in the human world. It came from the corner of the room, just beyond my sight. I turned slowly, my breath caught in my throat. And there, standing in the shadows, was the woman. But she wasn't just standing. She was moving toward me. Her face was twisted, her eyes hollow, her body jerking unnaturally, like a puppet controlled by unseen strings. "Help me," she whispered again, but her voice was no longer the voice I had heard before. It was deeper now, malevolent. And then, everything went black. When I woke, I was lying on the cold, hard floor of room 17. The walls around me were still, the air eerily silent, yet thick with the presence of something I couldn't name. My body felt heavy, like I had been unconscious for far too long. My head ached, and my heart pounded in my chest as I slowly pushed myself to my feet. I glanced around, my eyes scanning the room, searching for any sign of what had happened, any trace of the horrors I'd witnessed. But the room appeared unchanged. The same faded wallpaper, the same cracked lamp beside the bed, the same oppressive silence. It didn't feel real. It felt like a dream, or worse, a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I stood slowly, my legs weak, but the chill in the air was undeniable. I shivered, wrapping my arms around myself for warmth, my breath fogging in the frigid air. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to pulse, like they were alive, breathing in rhythm with me. My gaze snapped to the closet, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise as I saw the door creaking open, just slightly. I had to leave. I had to get out. But when I moved toward the door, the knocking began again, louder, more frantic. A desperate sound that made my blood run cold. "Please, help me." I froze, heart hammering in my chest. It was her voice again, the woman. But this time, it was accompanied by something else, something deeper, more guttural, like a low growl from the depths of the earth. I had to act. I couldn't stay here. But where could I go? The hallway was no longer an option, and the thought of opening the door and stepping into that darkness made my skin crawl. Suddenly, the door to the closet swung open all the way, as if inviting me inside. Without thinking, I rushed toward it. I couldn't explain why, but something inside me, some instinct, told me that the closet was the only place where I might find the answer. I shoved the door open and stepped into the small, cramped space. The air inside was suffocating, thick with the smell of mildew and dust. I felt my heart race as I turned back to the door, but the moment I stepped inside, it slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. The room seemed to shift. The walls stretched and warped, and the air grew colder still. I could hear the low growl again, closer now, vibrating through the walls, like something was moving just beyond my reach. I pressed my back against the closet door, trying to steady my breath, but the darkness enveloped me. And then, I saw it, the same figure, the same thing I had seen before in the hallway, now standing in front of me. It was too close. It wasn't a man. It wasn't a woman. It wasn't even a thing. It was something else. Something ancient, something that shouldn't exist. Its form flickered in and out of focus, like it was made of shadows themselves. Its presence was suffocating, pulling the very air from my lungs. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. And then it spoke. Too late. The voice wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could describe. It was like a chorus of whispers, like 1,000 voices all speaking at once, echoing in the very marrow of my bones. I felt its eyes on me, empty, hollow, pulling at my soul, as though it could see everything I had ever done, everything I had ever been. "Leave this place," it hissed, its voice slithering around me. "You were never meant to stay." The room felt like it was closing in, the darkness growing deeper, swallowing everything. My body was frozen, unable to move, my mind screaming for escape. But it wasn't until I felt the cold touch on my shoulder that I understood. I wasn't meant to leave. I had already been taken. The figure reached toward me, its hands skeletal and long, its fingers wrapping around my neck. And in that moment, I felt it, the final, cold emptiness that came with knowing there was no escape. The woman's voice whispered in my ear once more, but this time, I understood. "It's too late," she said, her voice now one with the growl. "You're part of it now." The world faded. The darkness claimed me. And I was never seen again. Light in the lake. It had been a long day of hiking, and we had reached the lake just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. The stillness of the water reflected the deepening purple of the evening sky, the air fresh with the scent of pine and earth. It seemed like the perfect spot to set up camp. There were 5 of us, me, my brother Liam, and 3 of our friends, all experienced hikers. We had heard stories about this lake, but none of us had expected anything unusual. We joked about how the locals claimed it was haunted, but it was the usual kind of gossip. You know, the stories you hear when you're far from civilization, where superstition thrives. The evening passed peacefully. We made a fire by the shore, cooked our meal, and shared stories under the stars. It was a typical camping night until something strange happened. I was the first to notice it, a soft, pale light coming from beneath the surface of the water. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the moonlight. The lake was so still, every ripple amplified by the dimming light above. But then the glow became more intense, clearer, almost as if something was shining from deep within the lake itself. "Hey, do you guys see that?" I asked, my voice breaking through the comfortable murmur of our conversation. Liam looked over at me, squinting toward the water. "What? That light?" "Yeah, it's coming from the middle of the lake," I said, my voice low, uncertain. "It's like it's coming from the bottom." There was a pause as everyone turned to look. For a moment, no one spoke. The light flickered, casting an eerie glow on the water's surface. It pulsed in a steady rhythm, faint but undeniably there. "Probably just some reflection," said Tom, one of our friends, waving a hand dismissively. "Nothing to worry about." But even as he said it, his voice lacked conviction. He, too, had noticed the way the light seemed to move, shifting slightly, as if it were alive. We sat there for a while, staring at it. It didn't seem to be coming from any of the boats, nor was it a reflection of our campfire. It was something else, something that didn't belong. "I think we should go check it out," Liam said, standing up. "It could be a reflection of something we're not seeing, or maybe it's some kind of underwater cave with phosphorescent algae." I wasn't sure if he was just trying to rationalize it, or if he was genuinely curious. Either way, I wasn't entirely comfortable with the idea. "I'm not so sure," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "What if it's something dangerous? There's no telling what could be down there." But Liam was already grabbing a flashlight and a paddle. The others, despite their hesitation, began to follow his lead, grabbing their gear to row out to the center of the lake. Reluctantly, I joined them. Part of me wanted to stay on the shore, where I could still see the light from a safe distance. But curiosity, combined with the sense of adventure that had brought us to this place, pushed me into the boat. We rowed out in silence. The glow in the water seemed to grow brighter as we neared it, the intensity of the light blinding in its purity. It was strange. Unnatural. "What the hell is that?" Tom muttered, his voice tense. "It's too bright for algae." I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as we approached the source of the light. It looked like it was coming from a crack in the lake bed, a narrow fissure in the rock deep below the surface. The water above it shimmered and danced as if the glow was reaching out, pulling us closer. Just as we were about to reach the spot where the light seemed to be strongest, a loud crack echoed through the air, and the light suddenly dimmed. It didn't go out completely. It just faded. And then, from below, a low, distant rumble sounded, vibrating through the boat. It was so deep, I could feel it in my bones. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I thought the lake was going to swallow us whole. "What was that?" Liam said, his voice tense now, eyes wide with fear. Before anyone could answer, there was a loud splash from beneath the boat. Something large, something powerful, brushed against the bottom of the hole. The water around us churned violently, the boat rocking wildly. "Get back to shore!" I screamed, but it was too late. In the chaos, the boat tipped, throwing us all into the dark, freezing water. The cold water hit me like a punch to the chest, knocking the wind out of me. For a moment, I was disoriented, swallowed by the lake's icy grip. Panic set in as I struggled to surface, my body fighting the weight of the water. I gasped for air, swallowing too much of the bitter, briny liquid in the process. As I broke the surface, I could hear the frantic splashing of the others. Liam was shouting my name, but the sound was muffled by the rushing water around me. I kicked my legs, my hands flailing, trying to grab onto something, anything. The boat had already disappeared into the depths, capsized by whatever had brushed against it. Liam! I screamed, my voice trembling, but it was drowned out by the roar of the water. My eyes darted around, desperately searching for my friends. In the murky darkness of the lake, I could barely make out their shapes. I saw Tom floundering to my left, thrashing as he tried to stay afloat. But the others? I couldn't see them. Grab onto me, Tom called, his voice strained. I kicked toward him, but the water was thick with an unnatural force, like the lake itself was trying to pull us under. Every time I thought I had a hold on something, it slipped away, as though the lake was unwilling to let us go. Tom reached out, his hand grasping mine. He pulled me close, but just as quickly, a force yanked us apart. A sound, like the deep rumbling I had heard earlier, rose from the bottom of the lake. The water seemed to tremble beneath us, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming pressure, as though the very lake was squeezing the life from me. Tom! I gasped, struggling to breathe. What's happening? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. His eyes were wide with fear, and his mouth moved, but no words came out. His hands reached out, his fingers grasping the air in desperation. Suddenly, I saw it, a pale, flickering light beneath us. It wasn't the same as before. It wasn't steady, it was erratic, shifting like it was moving through the water, toward us. Then, with a violent tug, Tom was yanked underwater. His scream was cut off instantly. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. For a second, I couldn't breathe. The light beneath me flickered again, closer now, like it was reaching out for me. I had to move. I kicked toward the shore with all my strength, every muscle screaming, the cold water dragging at me. I didn't know where the others were, but I couldn't stay here. The lake felt alive, its depths alive with something that wanted us gone. When I finally stumbled onto the shore, gasping for air, I collapsed onto the wet sand, my body shaking uncontrollably. My chest burned, my throat sore from inhaling too much water. I looked back at the lake, my heart still racing. Where were the others? I couldn't stop myself from looking out across the water. The light was gone now, the lake as still as death. There was no sign of Tom, or Liam, or anyone else. I didn't know what had happened. What had caused the boat to capsize? What was that light? But I knew one thing, something wasn't right about this lake. Something wanted us here. It wasn't long before I realized I was alone. Completely alone. The thought sank into my mind like a stone. My body was trembling, my thoughts spinning out of control. I didn't know what to do, where to go, or how to even begin explaining what had happened. I just knew I had to get help. The nearest town was miles away. But even if I could make it there, would anyone believe me? Would they think I was insane? I stood shakily, my legs unsteady beneath me. The moonlight reflected off the water, the surface shimmering eerily, but everything was still. The sense of peace was unsettling now. Too peaceful, given what had just occurred. I took a few steps back from the water's edge, not daring to look at it directly. But even as I tried to walk away, the feeling of being watched crept over me again, like invisible eyes were trained on me from the depths. I had to get to safety. I couldn't stay here any longer. But the question gnawed at me as I turned and began to move toward our campfire site. Where were my friends? What happened to them? I had to know. The night dragged on forever. I didn't sleep. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the lake, its surface calm, too calm, hiding whatever it was that lurked beneath. I could still hear the rumbling sound, the eerie silence that followed. I could still hear Tom's screams. I kept telling myself it was just a shock, that it had been a freak accident. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me out there, just beyond the edge of the shore. By the time the first light of morning filtered through the trees, I was already on edge. The air was colder than it had been the night before, and the chill seeped into my bones. The lake, now bathed in the soft glow of dawn, was as still as a mirror. Not a single ripple marred its surface. I couldn't bring myself to look directly at it. Instead, I turned my attention to the camp. The fire had long since died out, leaving only a few smoldering embers. The wreckage of our gear was scattered across the site, our backpacks torn open, some contents spilled out. It was all too quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before a storm. The pieces of the boat were gone. Not even a single splinter remained. The oddest part of it all, though, was the sense of something missing. The things that had once been so familiar, the backpacks, the tents, were all still there, but it was as though someone had erased the life from the camp. There were no signs of struggle. No sign that anyone had been here. I had to find my friends. My legs felt weak as I began to move, but I forced myself forward, stumbling along the trail back to the edge of the lake. The distance between the camp and the water felt impossibly long now, but I needed to know. I had to know what had happened. The lake stretched before me, silent, unyielding. My eyes scanned the shore, but there was no sign of anyone. No trace of Liam or Tom, no footprints in the sand. Then, something caught my eye. A small piece of debris, just beyond the waterline. It was a torn piece of fabric, something that looked like it had been part of one of our tents. I hesitated, my heart racing, but I couldn't ignore it. I stepped closer, and the further I went, the more I realized that the fabric wasn't the only thing I had missed. There were things in the sand, footprints, but not mine. They were fresh, and they led into the water. A sudden chill ran down my spine. My breathing quickened. I followed the footprints, drawn by a need to understand what had happened. They led me to the water's edge, where the sand met the dark depths of the lake. And there, just beneath the surface, was something else. A shape. At first, I thought it was another piece of debris, but as I focused on it, I realized it wasn't. The shape was too solid, too defined. It was a body. My stomach dropped. I felt my knees buckle, and I almost collapsed into the sand, but I forced myself to stay upright. The body was partially submerged in the water, its pale skin glowing eerily in the early morning light. It wasn't Tom or Liam. This body was different. The face, though partially hidden by the water, was too distorted to be recognizable, as though something had crushed it from the inside out. The body was bloated, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles. I took a step closer, my mind screaming at me to turn back, to run, but I couldn't. I couldn't leave it there, not like this. As I knelt beside the water, I noticed something even more unsettling. The body had a strange, faint glow. Not like the light from before, but something else. Something organic. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. And then, in the corner of my eye, I saw it again. The flicker. A light, deep beneath the water, just like the one I had seen the night before. It flickered once more, faint, but still there. I thought I could feel it calling to me, pulling me toward the depths. But before I could move, I heard something, a low, guttural sound. It came from the body. A faint, rattling breath. I froze. My blood ran cold. The body shouldn't have been breathing. It shouldn't have been alive. I scrambled back, my mind racing with questions, each one more terrifying than the last. What was happening here? What was this lake hiding? The sound of the breath came again. A wheezing, ragged breath. And then I heard something else. A voice. Weak, barely audible, but unmistakable. Help me. I staggered backward, my heart thudding violently in my chest. The voice that had whispered for help sounded so close, so real, like it was coming from the depths of the lake itself. But there was no way. I couldn't see anyone else. The lake was still. Silent. I had to be imagining it. The shock, the fear, it was messing with my head. I had to get out of here. This place was cursed. But the voice called again, clearer this time. Help me. I looked down at the body, my hands trembling. The face was still mostly hidden by the water, but I could see the faintest outline of eyes, unblinking, staring at me. The body had stopped moving, but something felt wrong. Like it wasn't just the lake that was keeping it there, but something else. Something that wanted me to come closer. I couldn't do it. I couldn't get any closer. I turned away, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. My breath came in sharp, shallow gasps. I needed to find a way out. I had to leave this cursed place. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the lake wasn't done with me. The stillness of the water seemed to whisper in my ears, drawing me back. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I took another step, still hearing the voice in my mind, but then something stopped me. A soft rustling from behind. It was faint at first, like the sound of something shifting in the trees, but it was real. I wasn't alone. I turned quickly, my eyes darting across the shore, but I saw nothing. No one. The noise grew louder, more distinct. I was being watched. The silence from the lake was no longer comforting, it felt oppressive, like something was lurking beneath the surface, waiting to pull me back into its depths. I took a few more steps away from the water, but then I froze. The body was gone. There was nothing left but the water, calm and empty. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, not daring to move, my mind racing. Where had it gone? It couldn't have just disappeared. I must have imagined the whole thing. But the unsettling feeling didn't go away. The sensation of eyes on me. The whispering voice. Help me. The words rang out again, louder this time, coming from all directions at once. It wasn't just the body. It wasn't just the lake. Something was reaching for me, something far older than anything I could comprehend. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as though something invisible was holding me in place, preventing me from escaping. And then, just as quickly as the fear had descended, I heard it. A low, guttural laugh. It was deep, unnatural. Like the very air around me had become alive. I snapped my head around, trying to locate the source of the sound, but there was no one. No creature. Nothing. I wasn't sure how much time passed, but I couldn't take it anymore. I had to leave. I had to escape this nightmare before it consumed me. I turned and ran, my heart hammering in my chest, my breath ragged in my throat. But as I reached the trees, a shadow moved across my path. I stopped dead in my tracks, my blood running cold. The air shifted, and the once familiar surroundings now seemed foreign, warped. I backed away slowly, every nerve in my body screaming at me to flee, but something told me it wasn't over. Not yet. I turned, ready to sprint in the other direction, when I heard a sound that made my blood freeze. The sound of footsteps coming from behind me. I whirled around, eyes wide with terror, but I saw nothing. Then I heard the voice again. This time, it wasn't a whisper. It was a scream. Help me. Please. My breath caught in my throat as the voice came from the lake. I turned my gaze back to the water, and there, just beneath the surface, was a hand. A pale, clammy hand reaching up toward me from the depths. I couldn't move. My body was paralyzed with fear. The hand emerged from the water, followed by another, and then the face. It was Tom. His face, bloated and distorted, covered in water and grime. His eyes were wide open, staring at me, pleading for help. But his mouth was stretched into a grotesque grin. Before I could scream, the hand shot out, grabbing my ankle with terrifying strength. The water churned around me as I was dragged back toward the lake. I struggled against the grip, but the hand that held my ankle was like iron. Every pull, every twist I made only seemed to tighten its grasp. The water around me began to swirl, dark and cold, as though the lake itself was alive, pulling me deeper, dragging me toward the bottom. Help me! The voice screamed again, only this time it wasn't just Tom's voice. It was a chorus, overlapping, distant, yet painfully close, voices of people, of things that had drowned here long before me. Their cries echoed in my head, filling the air around me, growing louder as the water rose higher. I clawed at the ground, the sand slipping through my fingers as I was pulled inch by inch toward the water's edge. I could see the ripples now, dark shapes just beneath the surface, something waiting, something watching. I screamed. I kicked. But my body felt as though it was moving in slow motion, like it was no longer my own. The more I fought, the more the lake seemed to pull back, resisting me. I looked up in desperation, and that's when I saw the light. It flickered from beneath the water, just like before, but now it was stronger, brighter. It pulsed in time with my heartbeat, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something. A face, twisted and unnatural, grinning up at me from the depths. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. I was choking on the cold, thick water as it surged higher, engulfing my body. The world above seemed so distant, so unreachable, like it had become nothing more than a memory. I heard the voices again, but this time they weren't just asking for help. They were laughing. Laughing at my fear. Laughing at my terror. No! I gasped, my lungs burning for air. I can't. But they were too strong. The pull was too deep. My vision began to blur, the world growing darker as I was submerged deeper. I saw Tom again, his face still grinning, his eyes hollow and endless, reaching out toward me. Join us. I could hear his voice so clearly now, as though he were standing right next to me, but it was so far away. The water was thick, suffocating, and my body felt numb. Every inch of me wanted to fight, but it felt useless. I opened my mouth to scream again, but only water poured in. I was drowning. I could feel the cold tightening around me, pulling me down into the depths. But then, just as my body gave out, just as everything went black, I felt something grabbing me, pulling me upward. Air. Cold, bitter air rushed into my lungs as I gasped, my eyes snapping open. My body jerked, desperate to escape the water, but I wasn't in the lake anymore. I was on the shore. The light was gone, the voices silent, and for a brief moment, I thought I had escaped it. I had survived. But when I looked around, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. The camp was still there, but everything was wrong. The tents, the gear, all of it was covered in a thin layer of mud, as though it had been underwater for hours. The trees around me seemed different too, twisted in unnatural shapes. The air was thick, suffocating. I stumbled to my feet, trying to make sense of it, but that's when I saw it. A figure, standing in the distance, just beyond the tree line. A shadow. A shape that wasn't quite human. I knew I wasn't alone. I started running, my legs heavy, my body aching with exhaustion. But as I ran, I could hear it, footsteps behind me, gaining on me. The sound grew louder and louder until I could feel the breath of whatever was following me on the back of my neck. I glanced over my shoulder, and for a split second, I saw it, a pale face, twisted with a grin, like Tom's, but wrong, so wrong. Its eyes were empty, its mouth wide, gaping, as though it was trying to scream. I ran faster, but the shadows were everywhere now, surrounding me. The trees seemed to stretch toward me, their limbs like fingers reaching out to pull me into the darkness. And then, just as I was about to reach the edge of the woods, everything went quiet. The footsteps stopped. The breath on my neck ceased. I turned, breathless, and saw nothing. No shadow. No figure. Just the silence. But I knew it wasn't over. Not for me. I was never going to escape the lake. The lake had taken me. And now, no matter where I ran, no matter how far I went, I would never be free from it. It had me. Forever. Night shift. The warehouse was always quiet at night, almost too quiet. I'd been working the late shift for months, and the stillness had become a familiar companion. The hum of the fluorescent lights above and the distant sounds of the city were the only things that kept me from feeling completely isolated. It was just me and 3 other guys tonight: Mike, the veteran worker who could sleep through anything, Steve, the new guy, and Tony, who was always running late. We were the only ones here, and the place felt even emptier when you're the only one awake. Around midnight, I noticed something strange. I was sitting at the desk, sorting through some paperwork, when I heard it. A soft scrape. It was faint at first, like something small had fallen. But as I focused, the sound grew clearer. It wasn't falling objects. It sounded like something dragging across the floor. I got up, walking slowly toward the sound. It came from the tool station at the back of the warehouse, where we kept our heavy equipment. Nothing was out of place when I got there, just the usual drills, wrenches, and hammers. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I glanced at the security cameras to reassure myself. The footage was normal, all the cameras showing empty aisles and quiet corners. No sign of movement, no sign of anything unusual. I turned back to the tools. Maybe I was just tired, I thought. Working long hours in a place like this could mess with your head. But then, I saw it. A wrench, just a few inches from where it had been sitting earlier, had moved. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I froze, staring at it, trying to rationalize what I had just witnessed. Had it shifted on its own? Maybe one of the others had come by and moved it? But none of them were anywhere near that part of the warehouse. "Mike," I called, trying to sound casual, but my voice came out a bit shaky. "Did you mess with the tools?" Mike, sitting in the break room with his headphones in, barely looked up. "Nah, I'm just trying to get some sleep." "Why?" I stepped closer to the wrench, examining it. It wasn't a huge shift, but it had moved. I pushed it back to its original position, and everything seemed fine again. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. I tried to shake off the unease crawling up my spine. It had to be a mistake. Just fatigue playing tricks on me. As the night wore on, things only got stranger. The sounds came back, this time louder. The drag across the floor wasn't just faint scraping anymore. It was a constant, steady noise, moving from one side of the warehouse to the other. I checked the cameras again, but everything was still. I walked toward the sound again, this time with a heavy sense of dread hanging in the air. The dragging sound continued, but as I turned the corner, I saw something even more unsettling. A toolbox, once neatly placed on a shelf, was now on the floor. And it wasn't just any toolbox, it was open, and the tools inside were scattered across the floor as though someone had been rifling through them. My heart began to race. I glanced around the dimly lit space, trying to figure out if one of the guys was messing with me. But none of them were in sight. "Tony? Steve?" I called out, my voice shaking. No answer. I felt a knot form in my stomach, and I moved quickly toward the break room to check on the others. When I reached the doorway, I stopped dead in my tracks. Mike was still asleep on the couch, headphones on, completely unaware of what had been happening. Tony and Steve weren't there, though. Where the hell did they go? I muttered under my breath, my mind racing. The lights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. I turned back toward the warehouse, my breath catching in my throat. Something wasn't right. I hesitated at the doorway, my heart pounding in my chest. Where had Tony and Steve gone? They were just here a moment ago. I had heard nothing, no doors opening or footsteps. It was as if they had simply vanished. I stepped back into the warehouse, eyes darting around the shadows, trying to make sense of what was happening. The dragging sound had stopped, but the feeling of something wrong was heavier now. The air felt thicker, almost suffocating. I couldn't tell if it was fear or just the oppressive silence, but I felt like I was being watched. I moved deeper into the warehouse, calling out once more. "Tony? Steve?" My voice echoed off the high ceilings, but there was no response. No sign of anyone. My mind raced, desperately trying to find a rational explanation. Maybe they went out for a smoke break? Or maybe they were just messing with me, trying to prank the new guy? But something told me that wasn't it. The weight of the air, the silence, it all felt too wrong. I walked past the tool station, where the toolbox had been. It was still on the floor, tools scattered around it. The wrench I had moved earlier was now gone. I stood still, staring at the spot where the tool had been, trying to make sense of everything. My eyes scanned the shelves nearby. Nothing had been disturbed. It was as if the wrench had vanished into thin air. A faint sound broke the silence. It was low at first, a whisper that seemed to be coming from the far end of the warehouse. I froze, straining my ears. The sound grew louder, clearer. It was a voice, a faint, unintelligible murmur that seemed to echo from the very walls of the place. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. Just the murmur, getting louder, more distinct. It sounded like a voice calling my name, but distorted, as though it was coming from underwater. I turned quickly, heart racing. The shadows in the corners of the warehouse seemed to shift, moving in a way that didn't make sense. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I wasn't alone. I backed up slowly toward the break room, my mind whirling with confusion and dread. I needed to find Tony and Steve. They had to be somewhere. Maybe they were hiding, trying to mess with me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I reached the break room, but there was still no sign of them. Mike was still sleeping on the couch, his steady breathing the only thing that felt normal. I glanced at the clock. It was well past 1 in the morning. How had they disappeared without a trace? My heart skipped a beat as the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway toward the back of the warehouse. The heavy, deliberate thud of boots against concrete grew louder, but there was no one in sight. I turned toward the sound, but when I looked back, it was gone. "Tony? Steve?" I shouted, voice desperate now. My pulse was racing, my breath shallow. I didn't want to be alone. I couldn't explain what was happening, but something told me that staying by myself in this empty, silent place was the last thing I should do. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, casting long, jittery shadows across the walls. And that's when I saw it. At the far end of the warehouse, in the corner by the large metal shelves, a figure was standing. It was hard to make out at first. It seemed to blend into the darkness, a dark, shifting shape. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, as if watching me. My heart slammed against my ribcage. "Who's there?" I whispered, but my voice felt small, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the warehouse. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to move toward me slowly, the floor creaking underfoot with each step. I took a step back, my legs unsteady, my mind racing. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't one of the guys. Suddenly, I heard the unmistakable sound of a door opening, quickly, loudly, followed by the sound of feet shuffling. I spun around in alarm, expecting to see one of my coworkers, but there was nothing. Only the heavy air, pressing in on me from all sides. And then, the figure moved again, much closer this time. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I ran. My footsteps echoed down the hall as I sprinted, heart pounding. Every sound in the dark seemed amplified, the creaks of the building, the sharp inhales of my breath, each step carried more terror than the last. I didn't look back. I couldn't. There was something in that warehouse, something that didn't belong. I crashed into the break room, slamming the door behind me. The fluorescent lights flickered above, casting long shadows against the walls. Mike was still asleep on the couch, unaware of the nightmare unfolding just beyond the door. I felt a momentary surge of relief, at least I wasn't entirely alone. But that comfort faded quickly. I knew I had to figure out what was going on. I glanced at the security monitors on the wall. There were 5 cameras in the warehouse, and none of them showed anything unusual. Just the empty space, the dark corners. But how could that be? I'd heard those footsteps. And the voice, my name. I could still hear it echoing in my head. I glanced at Mike again. His breathing was slow, deep. He wasn't going to wake up easily, and I wasn't sure I had the strength to explain what was happening, not even to myself. I grabbed the walkie-talkie from the counter and hit the button, trying to reach Tony or Steve or anyone. "Mike, I need you to wake up. We need to check the cameras," I whispered frantically, my voice tight with panic. But Mike didn't move. Frustrated, I looked back at the security footage, cycling through the camera feeds. Everything looked normal. Too normal. Click. The feed from camera 4 froze. I stared at the screen, but nothing moved. Just the static of the monitor and the occasional flicker of light. Click. A new frame appeared, a shadow at the far end of the warehouse. It was the same spot where I'd seen that figure. But this time, it was clearer. The shadow had form, it had substance. It was standing in the doorway between the shelves, its face obscured by the low light, its figure unnaturally still. My heart skipped a beat as I recognized something else. The shadow wasn't standing by the shelves anymore. It was moving toward the center of the warehouse. I pressed the talk button on the walkie again. "Tony, Steve, are you there? Come in, please. I need you to check the warehouse." Silence. I ran to the door, nearly tripping over the edge of the carpet, my breath ragged. I knew I was on the edge of something I couldn't explain. I had to find out where they had gone, Tony and Steve. They couldn't just disappear without a trace. Could they? I looked at the camera feed again. The shadow was gone. It was all in my head. It had to be. There's nothing there. I tried to calm myself, shaking my head, trying to rationalize everything. The footage, the strange sounds, Tony and Steve's disappearance, it was a coincidence, a trick of the mind in the dark. Or maybe it was just stress. I had been working too much. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. I checked the camera feed for any sign of movement. Nothing. I stood there for a moment, contemplating my next move. And then, the power went out. The lights flickered one last time before plunging the entire warehouse into darkness. For a split second, there was nothing but quiet. Complete silence. I froze, not even breathing. But then I heard something, the faintest sound at first, like metal scraping against the concrete floor. A shiver ran down my spine. Was it one of the tools? I turned toward the sound, unable to see anything in the pitch-black room. My pulse surged again, and my hands trembled as I reached for the door. Before I could open it, the sound came again, closer this time, sharper, a tool sliding across the floor with deliberate, unsettling precision. It's not one of the guys. I didn't need to look anymore. I knew I wasn't alone in here anymore. Something was moving in the dark, and it wasn't human. I turned to the walkie-talkie once more. Maybe I could still reach someone. Maybe someone could help me. And then I heard it. A low voice, soft but clear, from behind me. "Run." I froze. My blood ran cold. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears, drowning out all other sounds. The voice had come from behind me, but there was no one there. No one. I have to get out of here. I fumbled for the door handle, but my hands were shaking so violently that I could hardly grip it. Finally, it turned, and I pushed the door open. The cool air from the outside hit me, but I didn't stop. I sprinted down the hallway, my shoes slapping against the cold concrete floor. I couldn't stop thinking about that voice. It was almost like a warning, a command, run. But from what? From who? Was it a prank? Was it Tony or Steve messing with me? But no, it couldn't be. They were gone. Gone. I rounded the corner and skidded to a stop. There, in the dim light of the storage room, I saw it, something I hadn't noticed before. The shadows in the corner. They were moving. I shouldn't have come here. I should have just left. But it was too late. I was already involved. I took another cautious step forward, squinting into the darkness. The air was thick with tension, the silence suffocating. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, a brief flash of bright white before plunging everything back into darkness. But I didn't need light to see it now. There was something standing in the center of the room. It was tall, impossibly tall, its body silhouetted against the faint outline of the shelves behind it. I could make out no features, no distinct shape, just a towering, unearthly presence. And then I heard it again, that voice, louder this time, unmistakable. Leave. I stumbled backward, but I wasn't fast enough. I heard a sharp scraping sound, and in the next moment, the figure moved. It wasn't a shadow anymore, it was something else, something solid, something alive. It was coming toward me. I turned and ran. The sound of my breathing was all I could hear now, drowning out everything else. But then came the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, close behind me. Whoever, or whatever, was chasing me was right on my tail. I could hear it getting closer. My pulse was racing, the cold sweat dripping down my back. I glanced behind me for a split second. There was nothing. Just the empty hallway. But that didn't matter. I knew it was there. I could feel its presence. It was closing in on me. I burst into the warehouse, the door slamming behind me. The vast, dark space seemed endless, the shelves towering over me like some kind of prison. I didn't know where to go, where to hide. Keep running. Just keep running. I heard the unmistakable scrape of metal against concrete again. It was closer now. I could feel the floor tremble with each step it took. I had to make a decision. I couldn't outrun it. I had to fight back. But how? What could I do? The lights flickered once more, and I saw it. In the far corner, near the broken window, was a crowbar. It wasn't much, but it was something. I dashed toward it, my hand shaking as I grabbed it. The cold metal sent a brief shock through my arm as I turned back, trying to face whatever was coming for me. I raised the crowbar in front of me, my breath ragged. The footsteps stopped. I heard a low, guttural sound, like a growl. I didn't wait to see what it was. I ran. I ran until my legs burned, until the world blurred around me. But no matter how fast I moved, the footsteps were always there, just behind me, getting closer with every second. Finally, I reached the back door. The light from outside filtered in, but the air was thick with the smell of metal and decay. I grabbed the handle and yanked with all my strength. It was stuck. No. No, no, no. It wouldn't budge. I turned to look over my shoulder, but the moment I did, I saw it. The figure, taller now, towering above me, its shape no longer a shadow, but something more. It had come closer, closer than I had ever thought possible. And then the door gave way. I stumbled outside into the night air, gasping for breath. The cool breeze hit my face, and I felt a sense of relief that was almost too much to bear. But then, I heard it again. That voice. You can't leave. The voice echoed in my head as I stumbled away from the door. My body was shaking, every nerve on edge, every fiber of my being screaming to run. But something held me in place. The air felt heavier, as if the very atmosphere had thickened and was pushing against me. I turned back to look at the warehouse. The dim glow of the lights from within illuminated the vast, empty space. It looked ordinary. No sign of the creature. No sign of Tony or Steve. Just a cold, silent building. I tried to make sense of what had happened. I could still hear the voice, but this time it was in my head, a whisper, like a thread weaving through my thoughts. You can't leave. I had to leave. I had to get away from here. I turned and started running, my heart racing, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The parking lot was empty, the silence deafening. I was so close. I could make it to my car and drive away, far from all this madness. But when I reached the car, I froze. The door was open. My keys were gone. My mind raced. My hands searched the pockets of my jacket, desperate to find them. I should have locked the car. I should have noticed sooner. But my mind was fogged with fear. This isn't real. This can't be real. I was about to turn back to the warehouse when I heard something that made the blood in my veins freeze. The sound of footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. And there, standing just a few feet away, was a shadow. But not just any shadow, it was the same figure from the warehouse, only now it was closer. Closer than it had ever been. The moonlight cast an eerie glow on its form, and I could see it clearly now. Its features were indistinct, but the shape, the towering figure of it, was unmistakable. It's here. It's here with me. I took a step back, my legs weak beneath me, and the shadow stepped forward, blocking my way. I could hear that voice again, clear as day in my mind. You should have never come here. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but my feet were frozen in place, my body unable to move. The air around me felt thick with pressure, suffocating, as if the world itself was closing in. Then, without warning, the figure lunged. I woke up with a start. My eyes shot open, but everything was dark. I was lying on the cold concrete, the same spot where I had last stood. Was it a dream? I pushed myself up, my hands trembling. The world felt distorted. The warehouse was still there, still standing, silent, just as I had left it. But something was wrong. Something was off. I looked down at my hands. There was dirt on them. Blood, too. My clothes were torn. But I felt different. I didn't know how long I had been out, but the feeling that something was watching me never left. The weight of it pressed down on my chest, suffocating me. I stood up slowly, scanning my surroundings. Nothing had changed. The parking lot was still empty. The sky above me was clear, the stars shining down, but everything felt unnatural. The silence was deafening. Then I heard it again, the voice. You're still here. I spun around, but there was nothing. Only shadows. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I knew, deep down, that I couldn't leave. I didn't know what this was, but whatever it wasn't going to let me go. The last thing I saw before everything went black again was the shadow, standing at the edge of the parking lot, watching me. conversation in the room. I've always been the type to overthink, to search for patterns where there might be none. It's not something I'm proud of, but it's a part of who I am. I like to think it keeps me alert, aware of the world around me, and helps me avoid surprises. But that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It started innocently enough. The usual creaks of the house, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. But then, as I lay in bed, ready to drift off to sleep, I heard something unusual. A murmur coming from the room next door. I paused, my breath caught in my throat. The voice was low, almost imperceptible at first. Was it just the house settling? Or was it something more? I strained to listen. The voice became clearer, then another joined in, and another. They weren't loud, but they were there, just on the edge of my hearing. Too clear to be the wind, but too indistinct to make out. They spoke in low tones, like a conversation, but I couldn't make sense of any words. They came in and out, rising and falling like the ebb and flow of the ocean. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe it was the neighbors, or some old pipes groaning in the walls. I tried to ignore it, tried to push it to the back of my mind, but the whispers only grew louder. Was I imagining it? My mind was playing tricks on me, I thought. I had to check. I swung my legs out of bed, the cold floor sending a chill up my spine. The house was still, too still. I could hear my heart beating in my ears as I tiptoed down the hall toward the door to the next room. The voices were clearer now, more distinct, but still, I couldn't understand them. They didn't sound like anyone I knew. I reached for the doorknob. My hand trembled as I turned it slowly, afraid to make a sound. The room beyond was dark, just like the hallway, but as I stepped inside, I saw nothing. The room was empty. The bed was made. The air felt stale, but it was just a room, normal, quiet, and lifeless. I turned on the light, my pulse pounding in my chest. There was no sign of anyone. No one was here. The voices had stopped. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding, but the relief didn't last. The silence that followed was unnerving, like the calm before a storm. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that something was just out of reach, waiting for me to understand. I left the room, closed the door behind me, and stood in the hallway for a long moment, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But then, I heard it again. A voice, clear this time, coming from the same room. It was unmistakable. Did you hear that? The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I froze, my blood running cold. The door was still closed. No one was in there. But the voice was unmistakable. I rushed back to the door, my mind racing. I was already making excuses. Maybe I hadn't checked properly. Maybe I had missed something. But I knew the truth. The voice had come from inside that room. And it wasn't just one voice anymore. There were others. The whispers turned into murmurs again, a low hum that filled the air like static. I had to know what was going on. I ran to the hallway, grabbed my phone, and opened the voice recording app. If there were voices, I would catch them. I couldn't hear anything now, but I could record it. Maybe then, I could make sense of it. I hit the record button and waited, staring at the door. The room stood still, lifeless, but the air felt charged with something I couldn't understand. The voices came again, low, like a distant conversation I couldn't follow. The sound was faint but clear enough that I knew I wasn't imagining it. I had to hear it better. I stepped forward, my hand on the doorknob again. This time, I wasn't just going to listen, I was going to confront whatever this was. But when I opened the door, the room was empty. There was no one here. No one had been here. The bed was still made, the air still. And yet, I could hear the voices on the recording app. I played it back. And there they were, loud and clear, voices, talking, laughing, calling to one another, as if they had never stopped. Did you hear that? It's him. He's still here. He's been listening the whole time. My heart stopped. I stumbled back, my mind scrambling to make sense of it. But there was no explanation, no reason. Just voices. From a room that was empty. I shut the app off and backed away from the door, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I was alone. But I wasn't. I sat back in my chair, my hands trembling as I tried to process what had just happened. The voices were still fresh in my mind, ringing in my ears, despite the silence that now filled the house. They were clear, unmistakable, real, but where had they come from? My heart was racing, and I could feel a cold sweat forming on my skin. The recording app was still open, and I stared at it like it might offer some kind of answer. But there was nothing. Just the empty screen. No visual sign of what I had heard. The voices, they weren't there. I didn't know what was happening, but I was sure of one thing: this was far beyond anything I had ever encountered. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was sleep deprived. Maybe it was the house, settling into its old bones. Some creaky floorboards, or perhaps even a malfunction with the phone. But as the minutes passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something much worse. The house felt different now. The walls seemed thicker, as though they were closing in around me. The air, which had once been neutral, now pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. I looked down the hallway toward the room where the voices had come from. It felt like it was watching me, waiting. I walked back toward it, slow at first, then faster, as if something was pushing me forward. My breath was shallow. My mind kept racing, trying to come up with an explanation that would make sense, but it couldn't. It didn't. Nothing made sense anymore. I reached the door and stopped. My hand hovered over the knob again, the same trembling sensation running up my arm. What if there was something in there? Something that wasn't supposed to be? I wanted to believe it was nothing, just a trick of my mind, but the voices, they were real. The room remained still as I opened the door again, but the silence inside was different. It was thick, heavy with something I couldn't name. I stepped in cautiously, scanning every corner, every inch of the room. Nothing. Not a thing was out of place. The bed, the furniture, the curtains, they all looked just as they had before. Everything was perfectly normal. But the feeling, the sensation that something was wrong, was unmistakable. The walls felt like they were pressing in on me. I couldn't escape the sensation of being watched, of being known. I closed the door behind me, and it was then that I noticed a small change. The temperature in the room had dropped. I could see my breath in the air. It wasn't much, just enough to make my skin prickle with unease. Something had shifted. Then I heard it again. A faint sound, so faint I almost missed it. A whisper. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. The room was empty. But I could hear it again, and this time it wasn't distant. It was right behind me. He's still here. I spun around, my heart thundering in my chest. There was nothing. No one. The room was as empty as it had been when I first entered. He knows we're here. The voice was so clear, so close, that I could almost feel the breath on my neck. I took a step back, my hands shaking. I fumbled for my phone, but as I pulled it out of my pocket, the voices stopped. Everything was quiet again. My phone screen was blank. Why is he still here? I turned, my eyes frantically scanning the room, but there was nothing. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. He's been listening the whole time. The words froze me in place. I felt my legs go weak. The voices were real. I wasn't imagining them. Someone, or something, was here. And I had been listening. All this time. I didn't know how long I stood there, frozen, before I forced myself to move. My body felt heavy, like I was wading through thick water. But I had to leave. I had to get out of this room. I turned to the door, but as I reached for the handle, it slammed shut on its own. I jumped back, panic flooding my system. The room was still silent. But I knew something was here. I wasn't alone anymore. In that moment, all my thoughts were scattered. Fear, confusion, disbelief. My heart was racing, my body tense with the urge to flee, but my legs wouldn't move. I was trapped. He knows, the voice whispered again, now so soft, so familiar, that it felt like it was coming from inside my head. I backed into the corner of the room, clutching my phone, trying to steady myself. The air was growing colder. I could hear my breath now, sharp and ragged, as I backed further into the darkness. The room seemed to stretch around me, closing in. The walls felt like they were pulsating with something dark, something waiting. I couldn't explain it, but I could feel it. It was as though the room itself was alive, breathing in sync with me, moving closer with each passing second. I grabbed for the door again, this time twisting the handle harder, yanking it with all my strength. The door creaked open slowly, and I stumbled back into the hallway. I ran down the hallway, past the living room, and into the kitchen, my footsteps echoing in the silence. My mind raced. My heart pounded. What had I just experienced? What had I heard? But no matter how far I ran, the voices seemed to follow. Even now, as I stood in the kitchen, I could hear them, faint but there. Whispers. Conversations. Unfamiliar voices, all around me. I wasn't sure how much longer I could stay in this house, in this place that no longer felt like home. The voices were with me, and no matter where I went, they would be waiting. It wasn't over. It had only just begun. The days following that night were a blur of unease. I tried to go back to my routine, to pretend that everything was normal, but the shadows of the voices lingered, creeping into my thoughts at every quiet moment. I couldn't escape them, no matter how hard I tried. Work, home, errands, none of it felt real anymore. Each day felt like I was drifting through a fog, unable to shake the feeling of something watching me. The whispering, the murmurs that seemed to come from the walls, the air itself, it was constant. At night, I couldn't sleep. The moment the house fell silent, the voices would return, subtle at first, like a murmur from the next room. Then they would grow louder. They had never stopped. I had almost gotten used to them. It was an odd sort of dread that settled in my chest, familiar but never quite comforting. It wasn't until a week later that the situation took a darker turn. It was my night off, a Tuesday, when I got a call from Tom, a coworker from the warehouse. His voice was strained, frantic. "Have you seen Greg?" he asked, his words rushed. Greg. I hadn't seen him since the last shift. He was another one of the workers who often worked nights with me, a guy I'd shared a few shifts with over the past couple of months. Nothing unusual about him, nothing at all. But now that I thought about it, I realized I hadn't heard from him in days. "No, why?" I asked, suddenly alert. "He's missing. His stuff's still at the warehouse, but he didn't show up for his shift today, and no one's heard from him since last night. It's like he just disappeared." I felt a sudden chill grip my spine. My mind raced back to the voices. "He's still here." The words echoed in my head. Greg. Had he heard the voices too? Had something happened to him, something I couldn't explain? "Did you check his place?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Tom hesitated. "Yeah." His door was locked, no sign of a struggle. No note, nothing. I don't know what to think, man. It's like he just vanished. I could feel the tension in his voice. There was panic there, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. "I'm coming over," I said, my voice firm despite the rising panic in my chest. I grabbed my coat and left. The air outside was cold, biting, as I walked toward Tom's apartment. My mind was spinning with thoughts of Greg and the strange events of the past week. Had the voices been a warning? Had they been leading up to this moment? I couldn't help but think that Greg's disappearance was tied to everything that had been happening. When I arrived at Tom's place, he was pacing outside, his face pale and tight with worry. "You need to see this," he said, his voice low. We went into the apartment, and Tom led me to the living room where the TV was on. A recording played on the screen. It was from the warehouse security cameras, but something was off. The footage was from the night Greg had disappeared, the same night I had heard the voices in my room. I stared at the screen. The camera was focused on the hallway, the one near the back door. At first, there was nothing unusual. Just the usual quiet of the night shift. But then, a figure appeared in the frame. It was Greg. But it wasn't right. His movements were erratic, as though he was being pulled by something, his arms jerking unnaturally. He moved toward the back door, but there was something else. Something behind him. A shadow, a shape that flickered in and out of view, like it was distorting the air itself. I froze. I could hear the voices again, faint but unmistakable. The same ones I had heard in my room, whispering. They were calling to him. Suddenly, Greg turned around, his eyes wide and unblinking, as if he had just realized something was there. He started to run, but his steps were too slow, too heavy. The figure, whatever it was, moved faster. It reached him in an instant, and the screen went black. I felt my blood run cold. The recording stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence in the room. What the hell was that? I breathed, my voice hoarse. Tom's face was pale, his hands shaking. "I don't know. But I've been going through the footage, and that's the only part one can't explain. The rest of the night's just normal. But that's not." I turned to him, my heart racing. "What does this mean, Tom? Where's Greg?" Tom swallowed hard, his eyes flickering nervously. I don't know. But I'm scared, man. That thing. It wasn't human. I felt the weight of his words settle over me. The voices, the shadows, the disappearances, it all connected. Something was in the warehouse, something that fed on fear, on presence. It was pulling people in, one by one, and I was next. Suddenly, the air in the room grew heavier. The temperature dropped, and I could see my breath in the air. The voices returned, but this time they were louder. Closer. I grabbed Tom's arm, pulling him toward the door. We need to get out of here. But as we turned, the door slammed shut on its own. The voices whispered, louder now, and the walls seemed to move. He's still here. They hissed. I turned to Tom, my chest tight with fear. What's happening? What is this? But he didn't answer. His eyes were wide with terror as he stared at the corner of the room. Slowly, I followed his gaze, and my blood turned to ice. There, in the shadows, a figure stood. Not human. Not anything I could recognize. Just a shape, a twisted form that seemed to shift and contort in the darkness. It was too late to run. The door wouldn't open. The thing was closing in. And Greg was never coming back. My heart pounded in my chest, a deafening drumbeat that drowned out the whispers. The air felt thick, like it was suffocating me, pressing in from all sides. Tom and I stood frozen in place, our eyes locked on the dark figure in the corner. It was like a nightmare come to life, a shadow that moved like liquid, flickering and stretching unnaturally. I could see nothing distinct about it, no face, no form, but I knew it was there. I could feel its presence, like it was reaching out to me, pulling me toward it. Tom was the first to move, his instincts kicking in. He bolted toward the door, hands fumbling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I could hear the sound of his frantic breathing, the desperate tugs at the door, but all I could do was watch the figure in the corner grow larger, more tangible, as if it were drawing strength from the very darkness of the room. The voices grew louder, now mixed with guttural growls. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were commands. A cacophony of words that made no sense, but the meaning was clear. They wanted us. They wanted us to stay. Tom shouted, his voice trembling with fear. Get out now. But he wasn't speaking to me. He was speaking to the thing in the corner, like he thought it could understand him. Like it could be reasoned with. I stepped back slowly, my breath shallow, my mind racing. I could feel the thing's gaze, though it had no eyes. It was watching me, waiting for something. The room began to grow darker. I couldn't see the walls anymore, only that shifting shadow, moving closer with every passing second. My legs felt like they were cemented to the floor, unable to move. Fear held me in place, like invisible chains. I had to do something. Anything. Tom. I yelled, but he didn't respond. His frantic attempts to escape had stopped. I turned to see him standing motionless, his face pale, his hands at his sides, like he was under some sort of trance. I didn't have time to think about it. The air was so thick with dread that I could barely breathe. I didn't know what to do, but I knew that if we didn't leave right now, we would be lost, gone, just like Greg. There was no escape. Suddenly, the thing in the corner made a sound, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate in the pit of my stomach. The floor beneath us shuddered, like something was rising from the depths. My eyes flicked toward the recording device on the table. Why hadn't it caught this? I reached for it, hoping to somehow capture this, to have proof of what was happening. But as soon as my fingers brushed the device, the screen flickered to life. The display was blank at first, then it showed something else, a dark figure, like the one in the corner, but this time it was moving, shifting in and out of the frame, alive. The room's walls warped, bending and stretching in unnatural ways, as if reality itself was being twisted. I looked at the screen in horror. No, this isn't happening. Then I saw it. The figure was not only moving, it was pulling something. Someone. The footage switched to another camera angle, showing Greg's last moments. He was standing in front of the back door, frozen in place just as Tom had been. I saw his body jerk once, violently, and then he was dragged backward, into the shadows, his face locked in a silent scream. I froze. That thing had taken him. The thing that was here, in this room. And now it was coming for us. A sudden surge of adrenaline broke through my paralysis. I grabbed Tom's arm, yanking him away from the door. We need to move. Now. But Tom didn't move. He was still staring at the dark figure. His eyes were empty, lifeless. He was no longer himself. The thing, whatever it was, had taken him. I had no idea what it had done to him, but there was no trace of the man I knew in his eyes. I stumbled backward, my eyes locked on the shape that was moving toward us. There was no escape. The thing was coming closer, its form now clearer, more defined. I could see the edges of it, shifting like liquid smoke, a grotesque and unnatural thing that didn't belong in our world. And then, in a flash of horrific clarity, I realized the truth. It wasn't just here. It was everywhere. The walls were alive, the floor breathing beneath me. The space itself was warping, bending into something other, something ancient. The voices surged in volume, calling to me, pulling me toward them. Tom had vanished. He was gone, swallowed by the thing, and I was alone. But not for long. I could feel the presence closing in, feel its cold breath on my skin. The shadow that had been in the corner was now towering over me, its form shifting, coiling like smoke in the air. It was no longer a shadow. It was a figure, a thing with eyes, though I could never look directly at them. Every time I tried, they flickered out of my vision, replaced by the sounds, the whispers, the voices, and the growl. It wanted me. It had wanted me all along. And I knew, in that final moment, as the darkness consumed the room and the air became thick with despair, that I wasn't going to survive this. I was going to disappear. Just like Greg. Just like Tom. Just like the others before us. And there would be no trace left behind. No one would ever know what happened. The darkness took me. I woke up to an overwhelming silence. It wasn't the silence I was used to, an empty room, the hum of the night outside. No, this was something else. A stillness that pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. The air felt thick, like I was submerged underwater. I struggled to sit up, my head pounding, every movement sluggish, as though I were moving through thick mud. When my eyes finally focused, I saw nothing but darkness. The kind of darkness that doesn't let you see your hand in front of your face. I reached out, groping for something, anything. But there was nothing. Only the cold, empty space. Had it happened? The thought crashed into my mind, and with it came a wave of panic. What had happened to Tom? Greg? Was I the only one left? Was I dead? Was this some kind of hell? But no, it couldn't be. I was breathing. I could feel the air rushing in and out of my lungs, shallow but steady. My hands trembled as I pushed myself up. I was on the floor, not in the room anymore, but somewhere else. Where? Why? I tried to stand, but my legs felt weak, like they hadn't been used in days. I stumbled, my hand slamming into something cold, metal. It felt like a wall. My fingers traced the surface, moving up until they encountered a door handle. I gripped it and turned. The door creaked open with an eerie slowness. I stepped into another room, but it was still the same, nothing. The same oppressive silence, the same suffocating darkness. It was as if the entire world had vanished, leaving me trapped in some kind of limbo. I couldn't see the walls, couldn't feel anything but the unnatural emptiness. But then, there was a sound. A faint crackle, like a static noise, breaking the silence. I froze, listening. The sound came again, closer this time. And then, a whisper. It was faint, so faint that I wondered if I was imagining it. But no! It was real. I strained my ears, trying to catch the words. The whispering grew clearer, more distinct. It was a voice, a familiar one. Tom? I took a step forward, my heart racing, and the whispering became louder, more frantic. It was like a chant, a repeated phrase, though I couldn't make out the words. But there was something wrong with the voice, something off. It wasn't the voice of someone alive, it was cold, distant, like it was coming from somewhere far away, somewhere unreachable. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I had to follow it. I had to know what was happening. I moved toward the source of the sound, my legs trembling with every step. The air felt heavier with each passing second, as though it was pressing against me, weighing me down. I felt myself growing weaker, my body refusing to obey me, but I pushed on, driven by the need to understand. The whispering led me through the darkness, pulling me forward like an invisible hand. I stumbled through the empty space, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the thick silence. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. And then, I saw it. In the center of the room, there was a small screen, glowing dimly. It flickered, like it was struggling to maintain its connection, but it was enough. On it, I saw the faces of Greg and Tom. They were alive. No, not alive. Their faces were expressionless, their eyes wide open, staring at the screen in a blank, unblinking gaze. They were sitting side by side, but they weren't moving. The footage looked frozen in time. But the sound, the whispers, came from the screen. It was as if the voices were being drawn from their mouths, like they were speaking even though they didn't exist. I approached the screen, my breath catching in my throat. The whispers grew louder, and then a voice broke through, clear and unmistakable. You shouldn't have come. It wasn't Tom's voice. It wasn't Greg's. It was something else. Something ancient and terrifying. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and I could see my breath clouding in front of me. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the screen. I had to know more. Why? Why were they still here? Why was I still here? And then the answer came. The screen flickered again, and the faces of Tom and Greg distorted. Their eyes bulged unnaturally, their mouths opening in silent screams. The whispers turned into shrill, inhuman screeches. The room around me began to shift, twisting and stretching, the walls pulsing like they were alive. You shouldn't have come. You shouldn't have listened. I turned, my body shaking with terror. I could feel it closing in, the thing that had been watching me, the thing that had taken Tom and Greg. It was here, in this room, in the air itself. The walls began to dissolve, revealing nothing but endless, suffocating darkness. The room was collapsing, or maybe I was. Maybe I was slipping into the very thing that had consumed them. I reached out for the door, but it was too late. The whispers were no longer voices. They were sounds, chaotic, gnashing, devouring sounds. I could feel them pulling me, dragging me into the abyss. My body was no longer mine. It was part of the darkness, part of the voices. And then everything went black. The next morning, the office building stood silent. The door to the storage room was still locked. The cameras were still intact, their footage showing nothing unusual. But there was a sound, a faint, distant whisper on the wind. And somewhere, deep inside the building, a new figure watched from the shadows. The cycle was beginning again. The road with a ghost. I've been driving a cab for over 5 years now, so I've seen my fair share of strange passengers. Most of them are just regular people, businessmen, college students, late-night revelers. But once in a while, someone or something comes along that makes you question everything. That night was one of those nights. It started like any other shift. I had just finished a long day, and it was well past midnight when I picked up a woman. She was standing by the side of the road, barely visible in the dim light. I almost missed her entirely. She was wearing a dark coat, and her hair, long and black, was tucked neatly behind her shoulders. She got in without saying a word, just a soft click of the door shutting. The faint smell of lavender filled the car, and I couldn't place it, but it had an oddly calming effect. I adjusted my rearview mirror and looked at her, trying to make some casual conversation. "Where to?" I asked. "Just drive," she replied, her voice low and distant. It sounded like she was distracted by something, almost as if her mind was elsewhere. I shrugged and pulled away from the curb. The night was quiet, the roads nearly empty, and the city lights blurred in my side mirror. I didn't mind the silence. It gave me time to think, time to unwind. But as we drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. We passed a few familiar landmarks, and then I noticed the direction we were heading in. It wasn't anywhere close to our address. "Are you sure about this route?" I asked, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. "Your place is the other way." She didn't respond at first, and I wondered if she even heard me. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "Just keep going," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "I'll tell you when to stop." Something in her tone made me uneasy, but I didn't question it. I was used to strange requests from passengers, especially this late at night. Maybe she was tired, or maybe she just wanted to avoid the usual route. The streets grew darker the farther we went, the houses becoming more sparse, and soon I was driving through an area I didn't recognize. The city was far behind now, and we were out in the outskirts. A cemetery loomed up ahead, its iron gates silhouetted against the dark sky. "Stop here," she said abruptly, her voice now cold and final. I pulled over to the side of the road, the headlights casting a faint glow over the entrance to the graveyard. The woman didn't move right away. She just sat there, staring ahead, her hands resting calmly in her lap. "Are you sure you want me to wait?" I asked, not really expecting an answer. "I can take you back home." She turned to me slowly, her face pale and expressionless. "No," she said. "I won't be needing a ride anymore." The way she said it, so calmly, so certain, sent a chill down my spine. Something wasn't right. But I didn't want to argue. I opened the door for her, and she stepped out into the night. I watched her walk away, her coat swishing softly with each step. She headed toward the cemetery gates, her figure disappearing into the darkness. I sat there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Maybe I should have driven away, but there was something about the whole situation that felt wrong. I waited for a few more minutes, staring at the spot where she had vanished. When I finally decided it was time to leave, I turned the car around and started driving back the way we had come. But as I did, I noticed something strange. The street where I had picked her up was completely empty. There was no sign of her anywhere, no trace of her presence. No one had been walking down the road, and yet I could still feel the faint scent of lavender lingering in the air. I told myself I must be imagining things, just a late-night weirdness, nothing more. But when I arrived back at the garage, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. In the back seat, where the woman had been sitting, there was something small, delicate, and out of place. A bunch of flowers. I pulled the car over, my hand shaking as I turned around to grab them. There were no notes, no cards, just a small bouquet of white lilies, their petals still fresh. I held them in my hands, staring at them for a long moment. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I could feel a cold sweat starting to form. I had driven people to strange places before, but this felt different. Something was wrong, and I knew it. Who was that woman? Why had she asked to be dropped off at the cemetery? Why had she vanished without a trace? I didn't know, and I didn't want to know. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. The scent of lavender, the flowers left behind. It all felt too real to ignore. The next morning, I tried to forget about it. But when I passed by that same cemetery, I couldn't help but notice something. A small, freshly laid bouquet of white lilies resting gently by the entrance. I never saw her again. But every time I drive past that spot, I wonder, was she ever really there? Or was she just a ghost, hitching a ride on the road with me, leaving nothing but flowers behind? As the days passed, the strange encounter with the woman lingered in my mind like a haunting refrain. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that it was just another late-night oddity. But deep down, I couldn't escape the feeling that something wasn't right. The white lilies, the scent of lavender, and the way she vanished into the night, it all haunted me. A few weeks later, I had to drive past that same cemetery again. I was working a late shift, the streets were quiet, and the night felt unusually still. As I turned onto the road leading toward the cemetery, my heart began to race. I couldn't help but glance at the spot where I had dropped her off. My breath caught in my throat. There, by the iron gates of the cemetery, was a lone figure standing in the dark. A woman, dressed in the same dark coat. Her long, black hair flowed gently in the wind, just like the woman from that night. I slowed the car down, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. I told myself it couldn't be her. Maybe it was just a coincidence, someone else wearing the same coat. But deep down, I knew this wasn't normal. I pulled over to the side of the road, my pulse quickening. The woman didn't move. She just stood there, facing me, her figure outlined by the faint light from the street lamps. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. Should I drive away, or should I stop and ask her if she needed help? Something about her stillness made me feel uneasy, like she was waiting for me to make the first move. I couldn't stop myself from asking, "Do you need a ride?" I called out, my voice shaky. For a moment, she didn't respond. Then, she took a slow step toward the car. My heart pounded in my chest as she moved closer, her face still hidden in shadow. When she finally reached the car, she peered inside. I could see her eyes, cold and distant, but there was something more in them. A depth that I couldn't place. "Where are you going?" I asked, trying to steady my voice. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached out, her hand hovering near the door handle. Slowly, she said, "Take me home." I felt a chill run down my spine as I opened the door for her. The same lavender scent filled the air. It was the same feeling from that night, like time had frozen, and I was caught in the same eerie loop. I couldn't speak. I couldn't ask her why she had come back or how it was even possible. All I could do was drive. So I did, not knowing where she wanted to go, but unable to stop myself from moving forward. We drove in silence, the car filled with an unsettling quiet that made the world outside seem even more distant. As we neared the cemetery again, I couldn't help but glance at the rearview mirror. Her reflection was there, sitting behind me in the seat. But when I looked at her directly, she was gone. I slammed on the brakes. I turned around. The back seat was empty. I glanced at the road in front of me. The cemetery was just up ahead, but there was no sign of a woman. No trace, no shadow. It was as if she had never been there. But then, when I looked back at the empty seat beside me, I saw something small, delicate, and out of place. A single white lily. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't there a moment ago. I would have seen it. I would have noticed. But now, it sat on the seat, its petals soft and fresh. I didn't stop to think. My instincts took over, and I floored the accelerator, driving faster than I ever had before. I couldn't get away fast enough. The sound of the engine drowned out my thoughts, and I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination. But when I finally pulled into the safety of the parking lot at the garage, I dared to look again. I reached for the flower, my hands shaking. And as I touched it, I heard it. A soft, whispering voice, barely audible. "Thank you." I snapped my hand away, panic surging through me. My heart was racing, and I didn't know if I could take another moment of this. I grabbed the flower and threw it out of the car, not caring where it landed. But it didn't matter. The next morning, when I arrived at the garage to start another shift, I found the flower back in my car. No matter how many times I threw it away, it always came back. And then, one day, I was driving again. Same route. Same cemetery. This time, I didn't wait for the woman to appear. I knew she would. I could feel it. The air grew thick with tension, the world around me growing silent as I approached the gates. And then, there she was, standing in the same spot, waiting. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I kept driving. And when I passed the cemetery, I saw her in the rearview mirror one last time. She wasn't standing anymore. She was in the back seat. I froze for a moment, my fingers gripping the wheel so tight that my knuckles turned white. She was there. In the back seat. Sitting silently, just like she had that night when I first picked her up. I slammed on the brakes again, my body tensing, heart racing. The screech of tires against the pavement filled the air, and I quickly turned to look over my shoulder. But the seat was empty. There was nothing behind me. I whipped my head back toward the front, my breath shallow and quick, trying to regain some control over the situation. I glanced in the rearview mirror once more. The image in the mirror reflected back the same empty car, but my mind screamed that something wasn't right. I couldn't stay still. My eyes darted around, searching the car, the road, but the unsettling feeling crept deeper into my chest. I knew I couldn't keep pretending. This wasn't a coincidence, and I wasn't imagining things. The faint smell of lavender lingered in the air, and in that moment, I couldn't tell if I was suffocating or if it was just the weight of the fear pulling at me. "She's not real," I muttered aloud, more to myself than anything else. "This is just some kind of trick. A hallucination." I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, driving faster, pushing the car forward in an attempt to outrun the chill creeping up my spine. I needed to get away, but the deeper I drove, the more I felt like I was heading towards something I couldn't escape. Suddenly, the headlights caught a glimpse of something up ahead, just beyond the curve in the road. My stomach sank as I recognized the cemetery gates. The same place. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. A trick of the mind. But my body tensed all over again as I noticed something strange. There, standing in the distance, was the figure again. That same woman. But this time, she wasn't alone. There was another figure beside her. A man. Dark hair, dressed in a suit. And they were looking directly at me. I couldn't breathe. My hands went cold as I gripped the wheel tighter, pressing my foot down on the gas. The figures remained where they were, like shadows cast by an unseen light. I was speeding past them now, desperately trying to escape the scene. But then, I heard it. A soft knock on the back window. It wasn't possible. There was no way anyone could have gotten into the back seat so silently. Yet, the knocking persisted, each tap growing louder, more insistent. I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror again. I couldn't. But I couldn't ignore the feeling that someone was right behind me, staring at me. I swerved the car onto a side street, my breath coming out in jagged gasps, but the knocks continued. There was no escape. No matter how fast I drove, it felt as if they were following, keeping pace with me. I finally couldn't take it any longer. My hands trembling, I looked in the mirror. I saw her. The woman from the cemetery, sitting silently in the back seat, her cold eyes locked onto mine. My heart stopped, and I slammed the brakes. The car jerked to a halt, and for a split second, everything was silent. I turned around slowly, my body frozen in fear. But she was gone. The back seat was empty. But the scent of lavender clung to the air. And something else, something darker lingered, too. I couldn't place it. The silence was unbearable. I stepped out of the car, my mind racing, my legs weak. I needed to get away from this place, from her. I ran toward a nearby gas station, not even looking back. But when I got to the station, something caught my eye. There, lying on the ground next to my car, was the same white lily. It had followed me. I couldn't escape. The fear was overwhelming, and I didn't know what to do anymore. I glanced around at the empty, desolate parking lot, but nothing seemed to make sense. Nothing was safe. I wasn't sure if I was being hunted by something from the past or if I was simply losing my mind. But in that moment, I realized something worse. This wasn't a nightmare. I was living it. And no matter how far I ran, it would follow me. I didn't return to the garage after that night. I couldn't bring myself to drive anymore, couldn't bring myself to face the overwhelming silence that always seemed to follow me. The dread that haunted me grew heavier with every passing day. I moved into a new place, a quiet apartment away from everything that reminded me of the cemetery and the woman. But even here, I couldn't escape. It's been months now, and I thought I had finally put it behind me. That is, until today. I was at the park, sitting on a bench, when I saw her again. She was standing across the street, her back to me. Her dark coat floated in the wind, and for a moment, I thought I was imagining things. But then, she turned around. Her eyes met mine, cold and unblinking. A chill ran through me, and I knew, in that instant, that no matter where I went, she would always find me. She would always be watching. And as I stood to leave, I saw it again. A single white lily resting on the bench beside me. It had found me once more. Hands in the dark. The night was thick, the kind of darkness that made you feel like you were sinking into it. A group of us had gathered in the old house at the edge of town, a place everyone whispered about, but no one seemed brave enough to stay in for long. The windows were boarded up, the floor creaked with every step, and dust hung in the air, thick like fog. We came here for fun, to prove we weren't afraid, but the air inside felt different, heavy, almost like it was waiting. I was with my friends, James, Sarah, and Ben, sitting on the broken floorboards of the living room, the only light coming from the flickering candle in the center. The house was eerily quiet, save for the occasional groan of the old wood settling. But even that wasn't enough to drown out the unease slowly building in my chest. "Come on, don't be a baby," James teased, throwing a small rock at Ben. "It's just a house. No ghosts, no nothing. We're fine." But something about it didn't sit right with me. I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to move in the corners of the room or the constant drip of water from somewhere deep in the house, but I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. Sarah nudged me, a nervous smile on her face. "You good?" she asked quietly. I nodded, though I wasn't. The air felt thick, oppressive, and I could hear my own breathing too loud in the silence. It wasn't like I could leave. I didn't want to be that kid, the one who chickened out, but there was something in the way the house seemed to swallow sound, the way it seemed to stretch on forever, that made me uneasy. "Let's go upstairs," Ben said suddenly, breaking the tension. "You know, to the attic." None of us objected. It was probably safer than sitting here, and at least the attic didn't have the eerie weight that the downstairs rooms did. We grabbed the candle, and I hesitated for a moment before following the others up the creaky staircase. Each step felt like it was leading us deeper into something we shouldn't be a part of. The attic door was heavy, almost reluctant to open, but it creaked back, and we stepped inside. The space was smaller than I expected, filled with old furniture, boxes of forgotten things, and a heavy layer of dust. As we set down the candle and looked around, the room felt cold, colder than it should have been for an old, forgotten attic. I was just about to say something when I heard it. A soft scratching sound. It was faint at first, almost like an animal trying to claw its way into the room. But then it grew louder, sharper. The unmistakable sound of something, or someone, scraping against wood. We all froze. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound that now seemed to surround us. I nodded, but I couldn't speak. I wanted to say something, tell myself it was just the house settling, but I knew it wasn't. The sound was too deliberate, too purposeful. James, being the bravest of us, or maybe just the most foolish, stood up and headed for the door. "I'll check it out," he said. "Stay here. It's probably just a rat or something." "Don't," I started, but my voice caught in my throat as I watched him walk toward the door. The scratching was louder now, closer. It sounded like it was coming from the other side of the door, but that didn't make sense. No one else was supposed to be here. The door creaked open slowly, and James stepped into the hallway. A moment passed, and I heard him swear under his breath. Then came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, light but hurried, moving down the stairs. "James?" Ben called out, but his voice cracked, full of uncertainty. We waited in the dark, the silence stretching out painfully, but there was no reply. No sound at all. "Let's go," Sarah said, grabbing my arm, but I could feel the pull of the house, the urge to see what was going on. I stood up and followed her to the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The scratching sound had stopped, but the air was colder, more suffocating. We stepped out into the hallway. The stairs creaked under our weight as we descended, each step echoing in the empty space. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see James or Ben right behind me, but the hallway was empty. We reached the bottom of the stairs. The house was silent again, too silent. The scratching was gone, but now there was a sound, something soft, something faint. It was coming from the door. The front door. I hesitated. My eyes flicked over to Sarah, whose face had gone pale. Ben was still standing in the living room, staring at the door like he couldn't look away. There was no one there. But the door, it was moving. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, it creaked as though someone was pressing against it from the other side. The darkness on the other side seemed to pulse, as if something was just waiting, breathing in the shadows. I heard a soft, almost inaudible whisper, as if the door itself were speaking to us. Then, the door suddenly swung open, the wood crashing against the wall with a loud thud that echoed through the house. We all screamed, and I spun around to find that the room behind us, the attic, was now completely dark. The candle was gone, and the space seemed to stretch on longer than before. And then I saw them. 2 hands. Pale, long fingers stretching out from the darkness, wrapping around the doorframe. We ran. I didn't even look back. We scrambled for the front door, tearing down the hallway, through the living room, desperate to escape whatever it was that was waiting for us. We didn't stop until we were outside, breathing heavily in the cool night air, the house looming behind us like some kind of monstrous thing, watching. We never spoke about what happened that night again. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I feel it. A soft, scratching sound. And I know it's real. We didn't speak much the next few days. There was an unspoken agreement among us, an understanding that whatever had happened in that house, whatever we had experienced, was something that didn't need to be discussed. Not openly, anyway. I tried to convince myself that it was just our imaginations, that we'd let the spooky atmosphere of the house get to us. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. There was something wrong with that place. Something that wasn't entirely human. It's strange how quickly your mind can try to rationalize the unexplainable. I spent the next few nights lying in bed, replaying everything over and over again, trying to find a reasonable explanation for the hands at the door, for the shadows that moved when they shouldn't have. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. The house had been empty. No one else had been there. And yet, the hands, the whispering, it didn't add up. I kept wondering if maybe one of us had just imagined it in a panic, or if it had all been a trick of the light, some bizarre hallucination born out of fear. But then the dreams started. They weren't nightmares, exactly. But they felt real, too real. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that door, the old wooden one at the top of the stairs, creaking open, the pale hands reaching out from the shadows, grasping for me. I'd wake up sweating, my heart pounding in my chest, and for a few moments, I couldn't remember where I was. All I could hear was the sound of those hands dragging themselves along the walls, scratching at the edges of my mind. I told Sarah about the dreams, hoping to find some comfort in knowing she had felt something too. But she looked at me, wide-eyed, her voice trembling as she said, "I don't think it's over." The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. "What do you mean?" She looked away for a moment, then whispered, "Last night, I heard the scratching. It was outside my window. I thought it was just a tree branch or something, but it sounded different. Like it was right there, on the other side of the glass." My skin crawled at the thought. I wanted to dismiss it. I wanted to say she was just being paranoid, but I couldn't. The feeling of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight, it was too familiar. We agreed to meet at my house the next afternoon. It wasn't a formal plan, just a vague understanding that we couldn't be alone with our thoughts anymore. When I opened the door to greet Sarah, she was standing there, her face pale and drawn, her eyes red as if she hadn't slept at all. "I think it's following us," she said, her voice low. "Who?" "The thing in the house. I don't think it was just in there. I think it's following us," she repeated, and I could hear the terror in her voice. I didn't know how to respond. What could I say? I wanted to reassure her, to tell her it was all in her head, but I couldn't. I had felt it too, the unease, the feeling that something was always behind me, just out of sight, always just a step too close. "We need to go back," Sarah said, suddenly. My heart skipped a beat. "What?" "We have to go back to the house. We need to find out what's really going on." I stared at her, incredulous. "Are you out of your mind? We're not going to solve this by sitting around and talking about it," she insisted. "I'm not going to live in fear. We need to face it." I didn't know what to say. My body screamed at me to refuse, to tell her that going back would be insane, but there was a strange part of me that agreed with her. I had to know what was happening. We had to confront it, one way or another. I called James and Ben, but neither answered. I was relieved, but also worried. What if they knew something we didn't? What if they were too afraid to talk about it, too ashamed to admit that whatever we had encountered was real? In the end, it was just Sarah and I. We drove to the house in silence, the weight of what we were about to do hanging over us like a cloud. The closer we got, the more my hands gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. The house loomed ahead, its broken windows staring out at us like hollow eyes. I wanted to turn around, to drive away, but I couldn't. There was something in the house that called to us, something that wouldn't let us go. We parked at the edge of the yard, and I could hear the wind rustling through the trees. The house was still. Too still. "Are you sure about this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded, her face set in determination. "We have to. We can't let it control us." We walked toward the house, our footsteps soft on the overgrown grass. The door was ajar, just like it had been the night we left. The house seemed to breathe in the darkness, waiting. I hesitated before stepping inside, but Sarah didn't. She walked right in, her movements steady, though her eyes were wide with fear. I followed, trying to steady my breath, trying not to let the growing sense of dread swallow me whole. The house was just as I remembered, silent, abandoned, but somehow alive. The air felt thick, as though the very walls were closing in. I looked around, half expecting to see something, anything, but the place was empty. Then we heard it. The sound of footsteps. Not ours. Light and slow, but unmistakable. They were coming from upstairs. We froze. The footsteps continued, each one softer than the last, as if someone, or something, was creeping closer. I glanced at Sarah, whose face had gone ashen, her breath shallow. She was barely holding it together. I could see the fear in her eyes, a fear that mirrored my own. We stood motionless, not daring to speak or move. The silence in the house was suffocating, broken only by the soft, deliberate footsteps from above. It was impossible. We were the only ones here. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the house had settled, or the wind was making strange sounds through the broken windows. But no, this was different. These footsteps didn't sound like the house shifting. They were deliberate, like someone was walking around up there, right above us. I forced myself to move, one step after another, toward the stairs. I could feel Sarah's presence behind me, but she didn't speak, didn't try to stop me. We both knew there was no turning back now. The stairs creaked under my weight, each step amplifying the tension in the air. I half expected the floorboards to groan in protest, but the house was eerily quiet, except for the footsteps. The closer we got to the top, the more I felt them, the more I could almost hear their breath, cold and thin like the wind. At the top of the stairs, I hesitated, my heart hammering in my chest. The hallway stretched out before us, dark and long, the shadows playing tricks on my eyes. I looked down the corridor, my hand trembling as it gripped the railing. There was nothing there, no sign of movement, no figure in the shadows. The footsteps had stopped. I turned to Sarah, my voice barely a whisper. "What should we do?" She didn't answer immediately, her face pale and strained as she scanned the hallway. She reached into her pocket, pulling out her phone. "I'm calling James," she said, her voice shaky. "Maybe he knows something. Maybe." But before she could finish, the phone slipped from her hand. It hit the floor with a soft clink, and the sound echoed through the house. I froze, my eyes darting to the corner where I had thought I'd seen movement, a flicker of something, someone, just a shadow. And then I heard it. A low, guttural whisper. "Get out." It wasn't a voice. Not really. It wasn't human. The words felt like they were coming from everywhere at once, surrounding us. I turned, my breath catching in my throat. My heart pounded against my ribcage as I stepped back, pulling Sarah with me. We stumbled down the stairs, desperate to get out, but the door was it always locked? I yanked on the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me, a flood of adrenaline making everything feel hazy. I pulled again, harder this time, my fingers numb with fear, but the door stayed closed. Then I heard it again, louder this time. The whisper was sharper, more insistent. "Leave now." My head spun. There was no explanation. No way to make sense of this. I looked at Sarah, whose eyes were wide with terror. She grabbed my arm, pulling me away from the door. "It's not real. It can't be," she muttered to herself, her voice quivering. But even she knew it wasn't true. We were in it now. We couldn't run from it. The house seemed to close in around us. The walls felt like they were breathing, the floor shifting under my feet. I could feel the temperature drop, the air growing heavier, thick with the weight of something unseen. We moved down the hallway, searching for an exit, for anything that might lead us to safety. But with every step we took, the house seemed to grow more oppressive, the shadows lengthening, twisting. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was behind us, just out of sight, waiting. And then, as we turned a corner, we saw it. A hand. Just one hand, pressed against the door at the end of the hallway. Its fingers were long and thin, bone-like, its skin pale and cold, almost translucent. It wasn't like any human hand I'd ever seen. The nails were cracked, jagged, as if they hadn't been clipped in years. It didn't move. It just stayed there, pressing against the door. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The hand felt wrong, like it didn't belong to this world. I could see the faintest of shadows behind it, shifting like smoke, but they were too quick to focus on. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't listen. The hand slowly began to pull away from the door, and I stumbled backward, my heart racing. Then I heard a voice, not the whispering one, but something more alive. "I see you." The air turned frigid. I could feel the cold creeping into my bones, seeping through my clothes. I didn't know where it came from, but I could feel it. It was here. And it wasn't going to let us leave. I could feel the blood draining from my face as I backed away from the door, my legs shaking beneath me. The hand had disappeared, but the voice lingered in the air, echoing through the dark hallway like a curse. The weight of the silence was crushing. It pressed in on us from every direction, suffocating the air, drawing out everything except that chilling sense of being watched. We had to move. But where? Every direction seemed wrong, every corner hiding something worse. My mind raced, trying to come up with some plan, some way to make sense of what was happening. But nothing made sense. How could it? "Sarah," I whispered, my voice barely more than a breath. "We need to get out of here. Now." She didn't respond immediately, her face pale as she turned her head toward the darkness at the end of the hallway. I could see the panic in her eyes, but there was something else too. Something almost fascinated. As if she couldn't pull herself away from whatever it was that was calling us, whatever presence was in this house. And then I heard it again, this time, louder, clearer. "Come to me." The voice wasn't the same as before. This one had a definite shape, a tone that seemed to vibrate in the very walls, making my teeth ache. It wasn't just calling us. It was commanding us. I reached for Sarah, my hand trembling as I touched her arm. "We can't stay here. We need to run. We're not safe." But Sarah didn't pull away. She looked at me, her eyes wide and distant, almost like she wasn't there. I could feel a coldness emanating from her, and for a moment, I wondered if it wasn't her, but something else. Something that had taken her place. I shook her, harder this time. "Sarah, snap out of it. We need to leave." For a moment, she blinked, her gaze clearing, and then her eyes went to the door at the end of the hallway, the one where the hand had been. The door was open now, just a crack, but it was enough. I could see a faint light glowing from within, a pale, sickly glow, like something that didn't belong in this world. And then I saw it. The figure in the doorway. It was tall, impossibly tall, its shape a silhouette against the eerie light. It had no face, no features. Just a smooth, blank surface where a head should have been. Its arms were long and spindly, stretching down to the floor, fingers that seemed to reach toward us, as if inviting us to come closer. I couldn't move. My feet were frozen to the spot. My heart raced, each beat louder than the last, a drum that echoed in my ears. "Sarah," I whispered, my voice shaking. But she didn't hear me. She was already walking toward the door. No, not walking, floating. Her feet didn't even touch the ground as she moved closer to that thing. My mind screamed at me to stop her, to pull her back, but my body refused to obey. I felt paralyzed, unable to move, as if some unseen force was holding me in place. I tried to call out, but no words came. I could only watch as she got closer, her expression vacant, her eyes fixed on the figure. She stopped just in front of it, her body swaying slightly, her breath shallow. And then, without warning, the figure reached. Its fingers brushed her cheek, and in that instant, Sarah's eyes widened with something, recognition? A strange, slow smile formed on her lips as she leaned into the touch, her body relaxing, her face softening. Something inside me snapped. I ran. I don't remember thinking, I just ran. I rushed towards Sarah, shoving her out of the way, grabbing her wrist, pulling her with all my strength. The coldness of her skin sent a jolt through my arm, like ice, like death itself. But I didn't stop. I pulled harder, dragging her with me down the hallway, away from the figure, away from the thing in the door. As we neared the stairs, I glanced back. The figure was following us, its long limbs stretching toward us, but it wasn't moving quickly. It was crawling, like a spider, its body jerking and twitching unnaturally. I could hear it, its breath, soft and ragged, like something gasping for air. The house groaned around us, as if it was alive, as if it didn't want us to leave. The walls seemed to close in, narrowing with every step, forcing us to move faster, to run harder. But just as we reached the bottom of the stairs, the door slammed shut behind us, cutting off our only escape. I screamed, pounding my fists against the door, but it wouldn't budge. My mind raced for answers, but there were none. We were trapped. I turned to Sarah, her face pale and empty. She was no longer looking at me. She was staring at the dark corner of the room, her eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. Her lips parted, and she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's here." The room grew darker, colder. The walls seemed to shift, closing in tighter. I could hear it now, the sound of hands dragging across the floor, scratching, scraping. We were not alone. And in the dark, something was waiting. The air grew colder, the silence more suffocating, as if the very house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Sarah didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on the corner of the room, a blank, vacant stare that sent shivers down my spine. The whisper that had escaped her lips echoed in my mind, repeating over and over like a death knell. "It's here." I could feel it. Something was in the room with us. Something that didn't belong. The scratching sound, like nails scraping against wood, was louder now, closer. I turned slowly, trying to steady my breath, trying to make sense of the darkness around me. But there was nothing. Nothing but the shadows. The longer I stared, the more I felt like they were watching me, moving, shifting as if they were alive. Every corner, every crevice of the room seemed to hide something, something waiting, something hungry. I grabbed Sarah by the arm, shaking her, trying to pull her from whatever trance she had fallen into. "Sarah, we have to move. We need to leave, now." She didn't respond. Her body felt cold, unyielding, like she wasn't even there anymore. Panic rose in my chest as I realized how deep she had slipped into whatever hold this house had on her. She wasn't the girl I had known just hours ago. She was something else now. I took a step back, my gaze never leaving the corner. The scratching noise had stopped, but the air felt wrong, thick with anticipation, as if the room was holding something in its grip. I reached for the door, my hand trembling as I touched the handle. I tried to turn it, but it wouldn't budge. My heart hammered in my chest. I was trapped. "Sarah, please, come on," I screamed, my voice breaking. I shook her again, more desperately now. "Snap out of it. We need to go." She blinked, her eyes flickering as if she was finally returning to herself. For a moment, I thought I saw a spark of recognition, of fear. But it was gone as quickly as it had come. She turned her head slowly, her gaze sweeping across the room, her lips parting with a soft, trembling sigh. "It's here," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes wide with something I couldn't quite place. Fear? Hope? Or something darker? I backed away from her, panic clawing at my throat. What had happened to her? What had that thing done to her? I needed to get out. I needed to escape. I yanked at the door again, my fingers numb with the cold. It wouldn't open. The room was closing in on me, the shadows stretching like fingers, reaching for us. That's when I heard it. The sound, soft at first, but growing louder. The unmistakable sound of feet shuffling, dragging across the floor. A slow, deliberate pace. The sound of something, someone, coming closer. I turned to Sarah, my breath catching in my throat. She was staring at the corner again, her face pale and empty, her lips barely moving as she whispered the same words, over and over. "It's here. It's here." I grabbed her arm again, pulling her with all my strength. "Sarah, move." I screamed, but she was frozen. She wouldn't budge. The shuffling sound was right behind us now. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, a chill running down my spine. Something was in the room with us. Something was here, and it was getting closer. I turned back to the door, desperate now, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried once more to turn the handle, and this time it gave. The door creaked open, just enough for me to see the hallway beyond. But it wasn't empty. No, it was worse. The hallway was filled with shadow. Thick, heavy darkness that seemed to stretch forever, swallowing up the light. And there, standing at the far end, was a figure. Tall, thin, featureless, like a shadow given form. Its arms were long and unnaturally thin, stretching toward us like tendrils, moving with a speed that shouldn't have been possible. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I yanked Sarah into the hallway, pulling her through the door as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my ears. The thing was coming. I could hear it now, its footsteps quickening, the sound of its fingers scraping against the floor, dragging itself toward us. We ran, blindly, down the dark hallway, our footsteps echoing through the silence. But no matter how fast we went, the feeling that we were being followed never stopped. The darkness seemed to close in, pressing against us, until I could barely see in front of me. I had no idea where I was going, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let it catch us. Not now. Not after everything we had already gone through. And then, we reached the stairs. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed Sarah, dragging her with me as we rushed down, my heart in my throat. But before I could reach the bottom, I felt it, a cold, sharp hand closing around my ankle. I screamed, trying to pull away, but the grip was ironclad. I kicked and struggled, but it wouldn't let go. And then I heard the voice. Low, guttural, coming from behind me. You can't escape. I froze, terror flooding my body. The last thing I saw was Sarah's face, empty, hollow, before the darkness consumed everything. And the hand never let go. The car by the forest. I had been driving for hours, the kind of long, tedious stretch where the road seems to go on forever, and the only thing that keeps you company is the hum of your tires against the asphalt. The sun had set, and the only light now came from the faint glow of my headlights as I sped down the narrow, empty road. No other cars. No signs of life. Just the road, the trees, and the silence. I wasn't in a hurry, but I wasn't exactly in the mood for sightseeing either. The GPS showed that I had another hour to go before I hit the next town. It was the kind of drive you do when you've been on the road for too long, and you start to question if you're even awake or if it's all just a blur of white lines and shadows. But then something caught my eye. Just off the side of the road, barely visible through the growing darkness, there was a car parked under a cluster of trees. At first, I thought nothing of it. It was an old, beat-up sedan, nothing too unusual in these parts. But as I got closer, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The headlights of the car were on, but the car itself was empty. I slowed down, my curiosity piqued. Who would leave their car in the middle of nowhere with the lights still on? I pulled over, my tires crunching on the gravel as I stopped beside the vehicle. The night air had a chill to it, making me shiver slightly as I stepped out of the car. The silence was unnerving, like the world had just stopped. No wind, no rustling leaves. Just the quiet. I looked around, hoping to see someone nearby. But the road was as deserted as it had been for miles. No one in sight. The car was a mess, old, dirty, covered in a layer of dust. The windows were fogged up, and the interior was a shadowy blur. But what stood out, what sent an odd feeling crawling up my spine, was the key in the ignition. The engine was off, but the key was still there, turning slowly in the lock as though someone had just left it running. Why would someone leave their car like this? I approached cautiously, half expecting someone to jump out from behind the car and laugh, but there was nothing. Not a sound, not a movement. I peered inside the car, trying to see if anything had been disturbed, if someone had been there recently. There was nothing out of place except the eerie emptiness of the scene. I leaned closer to the window, and that's when I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. In the passenger seat, there was an item, a dark, crumpled coat, tossed carelessly onto the seat. The fabric was still warm, though it was hard to tell how long it had been there. Something wasn't right. I felt a prickle of unease crawl over my skin. There had to be an explanation, right? Maybe someone had broken down, maybe they were just out walking and would be back soon. But I couldn't shake the feeling. The car was too still. Too untouched. I walked around to the other side, my shoes crunching on the gravel. The closer I got, the more I felt like I was being watched. It was ridiculous, I knew. There was no one here. But I couldn't help the feeling that something wasn't right. I stopped when I reached the back of the car, my breath catching. The trunk was slightly ajar, just enough to make me feel uneasy. Why was it open? And why hadn't anyone closed it? I reached for the trunk, my fingers trembling slightly as I grabbed the latch. My mind raced with questions, but no answers. As I opened it, the cold night air rushed in, smelling of earth and decay. And that's when I saw it. There, lying at the bottom of the trunk, was a small, crumpled bundle of what looked like clothes. But as I looked closer, I realized it wasn't just clothes. It was a body. A man, his eyes wide open, staring lifelessly at the sky, his face pale and frozen in a grotesque expression. His clothes were torn, and the bloodstains were still fresh, staining the edges of his shirt. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. My heart slammed against my chest as I turned and looked around. No one. No signs of life. Just the darkness and the trees closing in around me. I had to leave. I had to get out of there. I turned to run back to my car, but then I stopped. A soft sound reached my ears, coming from the woods. A faint rustling, like footsteps in the leaves. I turned slowly, my heart racing. For a moment, I thought it was my imagination, just the wind or the trees. But the sound was getting closer, and it wasn't the wind. I froze, my body paralyzed by a sudden, bone-deep fear. Something was out there. And whatever it wasn't friendly. I had to move. Had to get away. But as I took a step toward the car, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The headlights weren't just on, they were getting brighter. And the car was moving. The engine had started. But no one was inside. I felt my heart race as the car's headlights illuminated the road ahead, blinding me with their cold, mechanical brightness. It was impossible. There was no way the car could have started by itself. My breath quickened, a knot of terror tightening in my chest. I didn't look back to see the figure approaching. I couldn't bring myself to. All I knew was that I had to get out of there, and fast. The sound of the engine revving in the distance echoed in my mind as I sprinted back to my own car, the gravel crunching beneath my feet with every desperate step. I could feel the cold night air on my face, but it wasn't enough to calm the burning fear inside me. My car, thankfully, was still there, parked just a few feet away. I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears as I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking violently. I got into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut behind me. My mind was a blur of thoughts, none of them making sense. I didn't know who had been in that car or what had happened to the man in the trunk, but I knew one thing for sure: I had to leave. The woods, the car, the whole situation felt wrong, unnaturally wrong. I put the keys in the ignition, my fingers trembling as I turned them. The engine roared to life, and for a brief moment, I thought I was safe. But as soon as I pressed the accelerator, I felt it. The unmistakable presence of something watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I glanced in the rearview mirror. Nothing. Just the empty road stretching behind me, bathed in the harsh, artificial light of my headlights. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. It felt as though someone, or something, was following me. The car's engine hummed steadily as I sped down the road, the wheels of my car kicking up dust behind me. I tried to focus on the road, but the image of the abandoned vehicle kept flashing through my mind. The man in the trunk. The key still in the ignition. The way the headlights had come on by themselves. It didn't make sense. None of it did. As I drove faster, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, I couldn't help but glance back once more, just to reassure myself. And that's when I saw it. A dark shape, small at first, emerging from the trees behind me. It was hard to make out the details, but I could see it moving, following me at a steady pace. I hit the brakes without thinking, the tires screeching as the car came to a sudden stop. My breath caught in my throat as I turned off the engine, trying to silence the panic that was surging through me. I sat in the dark, the only sound the rapid beating of my heart. My eyes darted between the rearview mirror and the road ahead. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to see, but I knew I couldn't stay here much longer. There was no sound. No footsteps, no rustling of leaves. Just the eerie stillness of the forest. The shape in the rearview mirror was gone, swallowed by the darkness. I blinked, trying to clear my mind. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe I had been out here too long. Maybe I was just imagining things. But even as I thought it, a cold, bitter truth gripped my chest. Whatever it was, I wasn't imagining it. Something was out there. Something wasn't right. With a sudden, overwhelming urge to get away, I turned the key and started the car again, the engine sputtering to life with a groan. My hands shook as I shifted into gear, pressing the pedal down hard, the tires gripping the asphalt as I sped away from that cursed place. I didn't dare look back. But as I sped down the road, the trees blurred in my peripheral vision, and that feeling, the one I couldn't shake, only grew stronger. It was like something was just behind me, following me. I could almost feel the air grow colder, a chill creeping up my spine. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. The car. The same car I had passed earlier, the one left abandoned in the middle of nowhere. But now it was on the road behind me, headlights glowing bright. The distance between us was closing fast. How could it be? I had driven away. I was sure of it. But there it was, gaining on me, the sound of its engine a low hum in the night. Panic gripped me, and I slammed my foot down on the accelerator, pushing my car faster, trying to outrun the impossible. The speedometer climbed higher and higher, but the car behind me wasn't slowing down. My breath came in short gasps, my hands tight on the wheel as I fought to keep control. I could hear the faint sound of tires skidding on the road behind me, the unmistakable noise of someone, or something, chasing me. I glanced in the rearview mirror again, my heart dropping into my stomach. The car was right on my tail. It was so close, I could see the outline of the figure sitting behind the wheel, but the face was hidden in the shadows, too dark to make out. I didn't know how much longer I could keep this up. There was nowhere to turn, no escape. I had to stop. Had to do something. I gripped the wheel, trying to steady my nerves. But the faster I went, the more I felt the presence behind me, the closer the car seemed to get. And then, just as I reached the next curve in the road, my headlights flickered. And in that brief moment of darkness, the car behind me was gone. Gone. It was as though it had never been there at all. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest, the car screeching to a halt as I scanned the road around me. Nothing. Not a single car in sight. The road was empty, just as it had been when I first saw the abandoned vehicle. But even as I sat there in stunned silence, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever had been chasing me was still out there. And it wasn't finished yet. I sat frozen in my car, my hands still gripping the wheel, eyes darting over every inch of the road. The silence around me was deafening, broken only by the rapid beat of my heart in my ears. The car behind me, the one that had been following me, was gone. But the feeling of being watched, pursued, lingered. The air felt thicker, colder, pressing in on me from all sides. For a long moment, I just sat there, too terrified to move, too terrified to even think straight. I had to get out of there. I knew it. But every time I tried to start the engine, my hands wouldn't cooperate. They were shaking uncontrollably, as though my body was frozen in place, unwilling to leave. I forced myself to breathe, to slow the panic that was threatening to overtake me. The only sound was the soft hum of my car's engine, idling in the still night. I glanced in the rearview mirror once more, half expecting to see the headlights appear out of the darkness. But there was nothing, just the empty road stretching behind me. It didn't make sense. The car had been there. I'd seen it, I'd heard it. And yet now, it was gone, as if it had never existed at all. I rubbed my face, trying to clear my mind, but the more I tried to rationalize what had happened, the more it slipped away. It felt like a nightmare, like I was stuck in some kind of twisted dream where nothing was real. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to drive away, to leave the whole thing behind. But another part of me, deeper, more instinctual, knew that leaving now might be the worst decision I could make. Taking one last breath, I turned the key in the ignition again, this time with more force, as if trying to shake off the paralyzing fear. The engine roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the accelerator. The car jerked forward, and I sped down the road, eager to put miles between myself and whatever had been following me. But the road was long, and the woods on either side seemed endless. With every passing minute, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The trees loomed on both sides, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands, brushing against the car as I drove by. The wind outside had picked up, howling through the branches, a chilling whistle that made my skin crawl. I couldn't shake the thought that something was still out there, following me, just out of sight. The headlights ahead, those same bright, cold beams, kept flashing in my peripheral vision, as though I wasn't alone on this road at all. Was it the same car? Was it following me again? I didn't dare look back. I kept driving, my hands clenching the wheels so tightly my fingers ached. The faster I went, the more I could feel the presence. It wasn't just the car. It was something else, something watching from the woods. I could almost hear it, a low, guttural growl in the distance, a sound too deep to place but unmistakable in its warning. I glanced at the dashboard. It was after midnight, and the road was desolate. I hadn't seen another vehicle in what felt like hours. The isolation of it all pressed in on me. If something were to happen, there would be no one around to help. The trees blurred past me, and the headlights cast long shadows on the road, stretching out in eerie, unnatural ways. My vision was starting to swim, and I couldn't focus on anything but the way the road seemed to stretch endlessly ahead. I had no idea where I was anymore. The familiar landmarks from earlier in the drive had long since faded, and I had no idea how far I had gone. The road seemed to wind endlessly, leading me deeper and deeper into the forest. The sound of my own breathing was loud in the small confines of the car. My pulse pounded in my chest, drowning out everything else. Every creak and groan of the car sounded like a warning. The wind whistled around the vehicle, sending chills down my spine. And then, as if to confirm my worst fear, I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of a car engine revving, the sound coming from behind me. I whipped my head around, my breath catching in my throat. There was nothing in the rearview mirror. Nothing but the endless stretch of road behind me. But the sound was still there. Low, persistent, like a growl of some unseen predator. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. My body tensed. I had to pull over. I had to know if I was just imagining this or if something was truly following me. I slowed the car down, pulling to the side of the road. The headlights cast long, ghostly shadows across the trees. I cut the engine, and the world fell into an eerie, suffocating silence. For a moment, everything was still. There was no growl, no sound of an engine. Just the quiet rustling of the wind and the distant calls of night creatures in the trees. I thought I might be imagining it. Maybe I had finally cracked under the pressure. Maybe the isolation had gotten to me. But as I sat there, staring out into the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. A sound broke the silence, a light tap on the passenger window. My heart jumped into my throat, and I spun around in a panic. But there was nothing. The window was empty. I exhaled, trembling with the aftermath of the sudden jolt of terror. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. That's why I saw it. In the corner of my eye, just outside the passenger window, something was moving. Something long, slender, and dark, almost like a shadow, except it wasn't quite dark enough to be part of the night. I held my breath. My gaze was fixed on the movement as it crawled slowly, inching closer to the car. Then, with a sudden rush, I slammed my foot on the accelerator again, and the car shot forward, speeding down the road at a breakneck pace. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My heart was hammering in my chest as I sped down the winding road, the tires screeching against the asphalt. The engine roared, the headlights cutting through the thick, black night ahead. I dared not look in the rearview mirror. There was no way I could. I had to get away, to put distance between myself and whatever that was outside the car. The trees on either side seemed to close in, the branches twisting like dark arms reaching out to grab me. The wind had picked up again, howling through the forest with an unnatural intensity. It felt as though the forest itself was alive, watching me, closing in on me. The car felt like a fragile shell, a thin barrier between me and whatever lurked in the darkness. I wasn't sure how long I had been driving. Minutes? Hours? Time seemed irrelevant. The road stretched on endlessly, a dark ribbon leading into the unknown. The trees blurred past in a whirl of shadows, and every now and then I would catch a glimpse of something, movement in the trees, a flash of something dark and formless just beyond the reach of the headlights. I didn't know if it was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. But the fear was too real to ignore. The silence inside the car was deafening, broken only by the pounding of my heart and the hum of the engine. The growl from earlier had stopped, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That I was being followed, that something was out there, waiting. A flicker of light caught my eye, and for a split second, I thought I saw headlights in the distance. A car? It couldn't be. There was no other car on this road. But then I saw it again, this time clearer. The lights were bright, far too bright to be from another car. They seemed to float, moving slowly along the side of the road, drifting in and out of view as though they were alive, alive in the way shadows are alive, unpredictable and shifting. My stomach twisted. I couldn't stop myself from glancing back over my shoulder, my breath catching in my throat. There was nothing behind me. No car. No lights. Just the endless stretch of dark road. But those lights, they were still there, just on the edge of my vision. Panic clawed at me, and I slammed my foot down on the gas, pushing the car faster, faster, as if speed could outrun whatever was chasing me. But the faster I went, the closer the lights seemed to get. They grew brighter, more intense, until I could no longer deny that they were there, directly behind me now. I swerved the car to the side of the road, trying to break free of the lights, but the car was right there with me, keeping pace. I could feel its presence, right behind me, just out of sight. The headlights were a blinding force, pushing me forward, forcing me to keep driving. There was nowhere to go. The road was narrowing, twisting around sharp bends. The forest pressed in on both sides, dark and oppressive. And that car, it was right there, always just a second behind, never getting closer, never fading away. I could feel the weight of the car's presence like a hand on my back, urging me forward. My hands were clammy on the wheel, my knuckles white from gripping it so tightly. I could feel my pulse in my throat, the taste of fear bitter on my tongue. I needed to stop. I needed to find a way out. But every turn, every straightaway, only seemed to lead deeper into the forest, deeper into the unknown. And then, everything went dark. The headlights, the car, the forest, they all disappeared in an instant. The engine sputtered and died, and the car lurched to a halt. The silence was deafening, the only sound the faint whisper of wind through the trees. I sat there, frozen, my hands still gripping the wheel, trying to catch my breath. I blinked into the darkness, expecting the headlights to return, expecting the car to start moving again. But nothing. I took a shaky breath and tried the ignition again. Nothing. The car refused to start, the engine silent, as though it had never been alive in the first place. My mind raced, trying to understand what was happening. The car couldn't just die like this. There had to be a reason. But I knew deep down, it wasn't just the car that had stopped. It was everything. I opened the door, my legs unsteady as I stepped out onto the roadside. The air felt colder now, the trees looming over me like silent, watching sentinels. There was no sign of the other car, no sign of anything at all. Just the stillness, the thick darkness that swallowed everything. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shape, darker than the night, moving at the edge of the trees. I froze. My breath caught in my chest as I stared at it, unable to move, unable to think. It was too tall to be a person, too massive, like something that wasn't meant to be there at all. Its shape twisted and shifted, the edges blurring in and out of focus, as if it couldn't decide what it was supposed to be. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I wasn't alone. I hadn't been alone for a long time. The figure stepped forward, and I could hear it, the faint rustling of leaves underfoot, the soft thud of footsteps. My body screamed for me to run, but my feet were rooted to the ground, paralyzed by fear. And then it spoke. A voice, deep and guttural, like gravel scraping against stone, came from the shadows. You shouldn't have come here. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. You shouldn't have come here, the voice repeated, and the words echoed in my mind like a haunting refrain. I stumbled back toward the car, but the figure was already closer now, its shape more defined, more real, as if the darkness itself was taking form, pulling me in. I reached for the door, my hand shaking uncontrollably, and the car jolted back to life. The headlights flared, cutting through the night, and the engine roared to life with a violence that made me gasp. My heart was still racing, but this time, I didn't think, I didn't question. I jumped in, slammed the door shut, and drove off into the night, the darkness pressing in around me. And the thing in the woods? It was still there. Watching. Still waiting. But I wasn't waiting anymore. I was running. As fast as I could. I drove faster than I ever thought possible, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel, my foot pressing down on the gas as if I could outrun the nightmare behind me. The road ahead stretched out like a tunnel of shadows, and the trees closed in on both sides like silent watchers, their twisted branches clawing at the night air. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The car, that thing, it was still out there, in the darkness, in the edges of my vision, lurking just beyond the reach of my headlights. I kept checking the rearview mirror, but there was nothing. Nothing except the blackness of the night that seemed to swallow everything whole. My heart was pounding in my chest, each beat a drum in my ears. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. I just had to get away, had to put as much distance between me and that place as I could. But no matter how fast I went, the darkness kept creeping in. The road was endless, twisting and turning in unnatural ways. It was like I was driving in circles, as though the forest itself was trying to trap me. And then the sound came. A soft, almost imperceptible thud from the back of the car. I froze. My mind immediately went to the worst place. It had caught up with me. I could hear it now, moving, dragging itself closer, closer. Another thud. Louder this time. And then a scraping sound, like something sliding along the metal of the car. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. It was real. It was real. My eyes shot to the rearview mirror. The headlights. They were back. I blinked, and for a moment, I thought I saw the figure. A shape in the distance, walking alongside the road, just out of the reach of my headlights. It was moving, slowly, methodically. I turned the wheel sharply, my heart racing even faster. I couldn't keep going like this. The road was narrow, and the car felt like it was sliding on the slick asphalt. I had no control over it anymore. My hands trembled as I tried to grip the wheel tighter, but the fear was too overwhelming. Another thud, this time unmistakably coming from the car's roof. I screamed. The thing was on top of me. I could feel its weight pressing down, the sound of its slow, deliberate movements reverberating through the metal of the car. I glanced up, and through the windshield, I saw the black shadow, tall, far too tall, looming over me, blocking out the stars. And then I heard it, a whisper. The voice from before, deep and guttural, came again, not from the road, but from the air itself. You can't escape. The words twisted around my mind like a vice, pulling me further into panic, further into the horror. My thoughts shattered as I fought to stay in control, to keep driving, to get away. But it was too late. The headlights flickered, and the engine sputtered. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it, that the fear had completely overtaken me. But no, it was happening. The car was losing power, slowing down. I tried to restart it, but the ignition didn't respond. My hands were shaking too much. The car came to a complete stop. The whisper came again, closer now, in my ear. You shouldn't have come here. The air around me grew cold, too cold for comfort, and the windows fogged up instantly, making the world outside look even more distant, more unreal. I couldn't breathe. My vision blurred. I felt dizzy, lightheaded. Suddenly, there was a bang, a loud, violent thud on the roof. I gasped, my heart in my throat, and looked up. A figure stood there, silhouetted against the sky. It was enormous, and it wasn't human. The shadows around it seemed to writhe, and the air itself seemed to shift in its presence. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I was frozen, caught between the fear and the realization that there was no escaping this. The figure's eyes gleamed from the dark, impossibly bright, and for a moment I saw them, its eyes. They were hollow, empty, yet they stared at me, cold and unblinking. I slammed my foot on the gas again, but it was too late. The engine roared to life, but the tires spun on the slick road, the car moving just an inch forward before it came to a halt once more. The figure on the roof leaned down. Its face was the last thing I saw before everything went black. And then, there was nothing. No sound. No lights. No car. Just silence. The next thing I knew, I was standing on the side of the road. The car was gone. There was no sign of the forest, no sign of the road. It was as if I had never been there at all. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. My mind was a haze. I stumbled forward, unsure of where I was, unsure of what had happened. And then, I heard it. The faintest whisper, carried on the wind. You shouldn't have come here. I froze. The road was empty, and yet I felt the presence of something watching me from the darkness. Something that had always been there. Always waiting. And in that moment, I knew. I wasn't going to escape. I wasn't going to survive. The forest had taken me. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.